Hi there, and welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history whispers in the dark. Tonight, we step into the neon haze of Las Vegas in the 1970s, a city glittering on the surface, but bleeding underneath. This is the story of Anthony Spilotro, the real-life enforcer behind Joe Pesci's ruthless character in Casino. A man who brought Chicago's underworld to the desert, who ruled the Strip not from the casino floor, but from the shadows behind it. They called him Tony the Ant, small in stature, but feared by everyone who crossed his path. A man who turned Sin City into his personal hunting ground, until the mob decided he'd gone too far. Before we disappear into that world, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it there right now? We love watching this underworld community stretch across countries and time zones. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe, join the family. Every week, we unearth the real faces behind the legends, the gangsters, the enforcers, the forgotten kings of crime. Now, take a deep breath. Let the lights of the Strip fade into the night, and step with us into the real Joe Pesci casino story, Anthony Spilotro, the outfit's enforcer in Vegas. This is Outlaw Icons, your sleepy dawn. Chapter 1. The Streets of Chicago. The birth of a tough kid. It's the summer of 1948, and the air in Chicago's west side hums with heat and trouble. A boy no taller than a store counter stands outside a candy shop, watching two older kids beat another into the gutter. His fists twitch, his jaw tightens, and there's a flicker behind his eyes. Something cold, something fearless. That boy is Anthony Spilotro, 10 years old, son of Italian immigrants, and already learning that in the patch, silence isn't weakness. It's survival. The patch wasn't on any tourist map. It was a hard pocket of Little Italy, crowded streets, tight families, and the kind of loyalty that could turn to violence in a blink. Kids there didn't grow up innocent. They grew up fast. By the time you were 13, you'd seen men in sharp suits leaning against Buicks, heard whispers about collections, and watched neighbors disappear without goodbyes. The smell of tomato sauce from kitchen windows mixed with the metallic tang of fear. It was a neighborhood that taught lessons with fists, not words. Anthony's father, Pasquale, ran a small restaurant on Grand Avenue, a modest joint that served cops, crooks, and everyone in between. His mother, Antoinette, worked herself to exhaustion, keeping 6 boys fed and out of trouble. She prayed hard. He worked harder. But even they couldn't keep the street out of their son. Anthony wasn't big, but he had a fuse that could ignite in a second. At school, he was quiet until someone laughed at his size. Then desks would topple, and someone would leave bleeding. Teachers called him unmanageable. Cops called him promising, just not in the way his parents hoped. In those years, Chicago's underworld was an empire wrapped in smoke and whispers. The outfit, as everyone called it, wasn't just a crime family. It was the city's shadow government. They ran gambling, unions, and half the politicians. And for kids like Anthony, they weren't villains. They were legends. Men who wore silk ties, drove Cadillacs, and walked through life with the confidence of gods. You could see them around the patch sometimes. Sam Giancana's boys, Joe Iuppa's crew. They had money, power, and respect. And respect was the one thing the patch worshipped above all else. Anthony's first arrest came when he was just 15. Shoplifting, petty theft, nothing major. But when the cop grabbed his collar, Anthony didn't cry or beg. He stared back with a smirk, blood on his lip and a dare in his eyes. The officer told his father, "You better keep an eye on that one. He's not scared of a damn thing." He was right. That fearlessness, or recklessness, became Anthony's trademark. It was the thing that drew dangerous men to him and, years later, would destroy him. By the late 1950s, the patch was changing. The old families were moving out, but the mob influence stayed behind, coiled in the alleys like cigarette smoke. Anthony's older brothers tried to stay straight. They went into business, worked jobs, helped at their father's restaurant. But Anthony, he drifted toward the guys in shiny shoes who never paid for their meals. Men like Marshall K. Fano, a slick-talking outfit capo who saw something useful in the fiery teenager. Kefano liked that the kid didn't flinch. He liked that Anthony could take a punch and still smile. In a world where respect came from violence, that was gold. Anthony started small, collecting debts, delivering messages, intimidating anyone who owed money to the wrong people. He didn't need instructions. He just needed a name and a reason. The outfit had hundreds of guys who could talk tough, but they didn't have many who'd actually do what needed to be done. Spilotro did. And once you proved you'd spill blood without hesitation, your world opened fast. He ran with Sam DeStefano's circle for a while, a psychopath even the mob feared. DeStefano taught him that fear was currency. You don't scare them once, he said. You scare them forever. Anthony listened. He watched. And when DeStefano wanted a message delivered to a man who'd double-crossed him, Anthony volunteered. The man ended up in an alley, broken and barely breathing. From that night on, the kid was no longer just another face in the patch. He was someone you whispered about. But violence had a price, and the police started noticing. The Chicago PD's Organized Crime Division began keeping tabs on Spilotro. They knew he was small-time, but he had connections. More importantly, he had ambition. He wasn't content just running errands. He wanted in, deep in. He wanted to stand shoulder to shoulder with the outfit's big names, the Giancanas, the Iuppas, the Accardos. And to get there, he'd have to earn it the hard way. There's a story, half rumor, half truth, about Anthony at 18. A bookmaker refused to pay the outfit their cut. Anthony showed up with two friends, dragged the man into the basement, and worked him over so brutally that when they left, even the old-timers whispered that the kid had gone too far. But in mob logic, too far was the same as effective. Joe Iuppa, one of the outfit's rising bosses, took notice. He liked the boy's fire. Soon, Anthony was doing jobs under Iuppa's protection. By the early 1960s, Chicago was crawling with young toughs trying to make their name. But Anthony had something the others didn't, a sense of purpose wrapped in silence. He didn't brag. He didn't talk. He just did. That quiet ruthlessness earned him his first nickname, the Ant, not because of his size, though he was small, but because ants are relentless. You can crush one, and the rest keep coming. That was Spilotro, relentless, focused, impossible to scare. He still helped out at his father's restaurant from time to time, serving spaghetti to men he now called his bosses. His father never asked questions. But there were nights when the old man's eyes lingered too long on his son's bruised knuckles, and the silence between them felt heavier than words. Anthony loved his family, but he loved power more. And in the patch, love didn't keep you safe. Fear did. It was around this time he began hanging around a young bookmaker named Frank Collada. They were opposites. Collada was slick, loud, always talking, but together they made sense. Collada had connections and charisma. Spilotro had the kind of coldness that got results. They'd rob, extort, collect, and split the money like brothers. The streets taught them loyalty, but only up to the point where survival took over. The outfit noticed. Men like Felix, Milwaukee Phil, Alderiggio began testing him with riskier assignments, roughing up union guys, shaking down local bars, even tracking down witnesses. The more he did, the more he was trusted. The more he was trusted, the deeper he sank. It wasn't long before Spilotro's name was being whispered in rooms where orders were given, not taken. But there was something else under the surface, a restlessness. The Chicago bosses saw Vegas as the future. Gambling was legal there, and money flowed like water. But it was also crawling with other families. The Cleveland mob, Kansas City, even New York had their eyes on the desert. To control Las Vegas, the outfit needed enforcers who weren't afraid of blood or headlines. They needed someone who could keep the skim running and outsiders quiet. Someone loyal, fearless, and already half invisible to the law. Spilotro fit the bill. Still, in those days, he was just another soldier dreaming of bigger things. He spent nights in smoky bars, listening to old mobsters talk about the Vegas casinos, how millions disappeared off the books before the government ever saw a cent. He'd watch them play cards, their faces unreadable, their cigars glowing like warning lights. He didn't say much, but in his mind, he was already there, walking under the neon lights, collecting his share. Back home, his reputation grew darker. There were beatings, threats, and one murder he was questioned for, but never charged with. Police reports described him as dangerous and unpredictable. Friends said he was loyal to a fault, until you crossed him. Then loyalty turned to vengeance. He had a habit of smiling right before he hit someone, as if the act itself brought him peace. That unnerved people more than the violence. Sometimes, late at night, he'd drive around the city, headlights slicing through fog, thinking about what he wanted. Chicago had raised him, hardened him, given him purpose, but it was also closing in. Every block held ghosts. Men who'd been heroes one year and bodies in alleys the next. The streets that built him were starting to feel small. By 1962, his name had crossed enough desks that when the outfit needed muscle for their Vegas interests, Spilotro's came up fast. But before that, there was one final act that sealed his reputation. A gruesome murder that made even the hardened bosses shake their heads. Two low-level thieves, Billy McCarthy and Jimmy Miraglia, had robbed a mob-connected bar without permission. It was a mistake that cost them their lives. The outfit wanted to make an example. Spilotro volunteered. What happened next became legend in Chicago's underworld. The details were whispered more than told, but the message was clear. Tony the Ant didn't just kill. He made you wish he had sooner. The brutality stunned even his peers, but it also sent a clear signal up the chain. He was loyal, efficient, and unafraid of blood. For the Chicago outfit, that made him invaluable. After that night, his path was set. There was no going back to serving spaghetti or sweeping the restaurant floor. The boy from the patch had become something else, a man whose name carried both respect and dread. His parents never asked where the money came from. Maybe they didn't want to know. Maybe they already did. As the decade turned, Spilotro stood at the edge of something much bigger. Chicago was getting too hot, too visible. The outfit was expanding west, chasing money under the desert sun. They needed someone to protect their interests in a city built on greed and illusion. A place where law and crime blurred under neon light. And somewhere in the smoke-filled rooms of Cicero, the bosses whispered his name. Anthony Spilotro, the Ant, the kid from the patch. The next call he'd get wouldn't be for another shakedown or beating. It would be for Vegas, a place where dreams burned fast, and men like him didn't need to hide in alleys. They ruled from the shadows of casinos. But before that plane ticket, before the lights and the blood and the fame, Anthony spent one last night driving through his old neighborhood. The streets were quiet now, the same cracked sidewalks, the same flickering lamps. He passed the candy shop, the one where it all started. For a second, he almost stopped. But then he smiled, a small, cold smile, and kept driving. Because in Chicago, the past was something you didn't revisit. You buried it. And for Tony the Ant, the next time he'd dig something up, it wouldn't be memories. It would be bodies. Chapter 2. The outfit's young blood, entering the Chicago mob. The year was 1956, and Chicago was still a city that moved to the rhythm of power and fear. Smoke rose from factory stacks, deals were made in back rooms, and the outfit's grip tightened like a hand around the throat of everything that mattered. Politics, unions, gambling, and every dollar that flowed through the city's veins. In that world, Anthony Spilotro was no longer a reckless kid from the patch. He was a young man with a reputation, a pair of cold eyes, and a knack for violence that made him both valuable and dangerous. He had already crossed the line most people never even approached, and there was no turning back. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just surviving the streets. He was being invited into their control. His introduction came slowly, quietly, as all true mob introductions did. No ceremony, no handshake of honor, no whispered oath. Just small jobs that built trust, debts that got collected, people who stopped showing up where they shouldn't. Chicago was a chessboard, and the outfit needed pawns who could hit hard and never talk. Anthony was perfect for that. He understood the silence. It wasn't about being unseen. It was about being unpredictable. Nobody knew what the kid would do next, not even the men who gave him orders. And that made him dangerous in a way that even the bosses respected. The outfit in those years was transitioning. The old guard, Tony Accardo, Paul Ricca, and Sam Giancana, were still pulling strings, but the city was changing fast. Vegas money was beginning to flow back east. Unions were expanding. The FBI had started paying attention. The bosses needed young men who could operate in this new world without hesitation or conscience. Anthony had grown up idolizing these men. To him, they were larger than life, untouchable. He didn't see the cracks forming under their power. He saw only opportunity, the kind that could turn a street kid into a legend. It started with Joe Pesci, the calm, calculating outfit lieutenant who controlled Cicero and parts of the western suburbs. Pesci was nothing like the wild killers who ran the street corners. He was a businessman, quiet and ruthless, who turned profits where others turned bodies. He noticed Anthony early. A friend of Pesci's once told him about a small-time brawler who collected money faster than anyone else, who didn't drink, didn't brag, and didn't flinch when a job turned bloody. Pesci sent for him. The meeting was held in a smoke-filled backroom of a Cicero bar. Pesci didn't talk much. He studied Spilotro for a long time before speaking. He asked about loyalty, about family, about how far he'd go for respect. Anthony didn't have to think. As far as I'm told to, he said. It wasn't bravado, it was clarity. Pesci nodded. That was all he needed. The kid would get his first job that night. It was small, a warning to a bookmaker who'd been holding back the outfit share. Anthony went alone. The next morning, the man had a broken nose, a missing tooth, and no doubts about who he owed. The money was delivered on time from then on. Word spread fast. The outfit was always listening, always watching, and they liked what they saw. Anthony wasn't flashy. He didn't draw attention to himself. When other young enforcers tried to climb the ranks by showing off, by drinking, by being seen, Spilotro stayed quiet. He'd sit in the corner of bars, smoking, watching, calculating. The bosses liked that. It reminded them of the old ways. Men who let their actions speak, not their mouths. Soon, Anthony wasn't just another soldier. He was being groomed for something bigger. But even in that world, trust was a fragile thing. To the outfit, everyone was expendable. You were useful until you weren't. And Anthony understood that better than most. He'd seen what happened to guys who got sloppy. He'd helped bury a few. It was a harsh education in power, the kind that stripped away any illusion of brotherhood. The mob talked about family, but it was business. Every handshake had a price, every smile a blade behind it. Marshal Caifano became one of Spilotro's early mentors. Caifano was the outfit's muscle in Vegas before the city truly exploded with money. He was elegant, brutal, and always dressed like a movie star. Under his guidance, Anthony learned how the mob blended violence with charm, intimidation with control. You didn't always need to break bones to win respect. Sometimes, you just needed to make a man believe you could. Caifano called it the art of presence, being the kind of man whose silence was louder than a threat. Spilotro mastered it. Yet for all his composure, there was always a storm underneath. The rage that had followed him from childhood never really left. It just got sharper, colder. He wasn't the kind of man who enjoyed chaos. He was the kind who used it. When the outfit needed a message sent, they sent Tony. And when Tony showed up, the message was delivered with terrifying clarity. Cops started calling him the kid with the dead eyes. Reporters didn't know his name yet, but they would. Soon enough, everyone would. Chicago in those days was a living organism, pulsing with corruption. Politicians played golf with mobsters. Judges owed favors. Cops looked the other way, as long as envelopes landed on their desks. It was an empire hidden in plain sight, and Anthony was becoming one of its soldiers, a man who made sure the gears kept turning, no matter what it cost. Still, he had a code. As violent as he could be, there were lines he didn't cross without reason. He didn't hurt civilians unless ordered. He didn't touch women or kids. And he didn't talk. In a world built on betrayal, silence was his shield. But the more he proved himself, the more he was asked to do. And in the outfit, once you crossed one line, another always waited. Frank Collada stayed, close through it all. He and Anthony were like two sides of a coin. Frank was the hustler, Tony the muscle. Together, they were unstoppable. They pulled off robberies, collections, and small-time rackets that lined their pockets and caught the attention of higher-ups. But Anthony wasn't after money anymore. Money was just the surface. He was after status. To him, being feared was worth more than being rich. Fear meant power. And in the mob, power was life insurance. There was a moment in the late 50s when Spilotro's path could have changed. His father grew ill, and the family business began to crumble. His brothers begged him to help run the restaurant, to step away from the streets, to be something better. But by then, Anthony was too deep. The restaurant's soft lights and family dinners felt foreign. He'd tasted control, and ordinary life couldn't compete. He told his mother he'd try, but within weeks, he was back in Cicero, sitting in smoky bars, waiting for the next job. Some men are born to build, others to destroy. Anthony knew which one he was. In 1960, the outfit's operations in Chicago were flourishing, but the bosses were paranoid. Informants were everywhere, and federal heat was closing in. The mob needed enforcers who didn't ask questions and didn't panic under pressure. When someone needed to disappear, Spilotro's name came up. The M&M murders, the same brutal killings that earned him his reputation, cemented his standing. But even before that, there were smaller, darker jobs. People who'd stolen from the wrong rackets, men who'd refused orders. Each disappearance added another brick to his reputation. He was no longer the kid with something to prove. He was a man others feared to even look in the eye. He was also learning how to manage that fear. Violence was effective, but overused, it drew attention. The best killers in the outfit were the ones who made others destroy themselves out of dread. Anthony started doing that too. He'd show up unannounced at a debtor's home, say nothing, just stare. The silence did the work for him. One man cracked after a single visit, drove across town, and left cash at a bar just to make it stop. Spilotro learned that true power wasn't about the blood you spilled. It was about the fear you left behind. By now, Iappa was more than a mentor. He was a doorway. Through him, Spilotro began connecting with other high-ranking members. Tony Accardo, the quiet old boss who ran everything from behind the curtain, and Sam Giancana, whose temper and ambition mirrored Tony's own. He watched these men carefully, studied how they commanded rooms without raising their voices. They never begged for respect. They absorbed it. Spilotro wanted that kind of gravity, the kind that made lesser men orbit around you. He also learned how politics intertwined with crime. The outfit didn't just control illegal businesses. They controlled city contracts, labor unions, construction. Money wasn't just skimmed from casinos. It was built into skyscrapers. Anthony saw that violence was only one tool of power, not the foundation. But it was the one tool he wielded best. Every time he was called for a job, he delivered. Every time he was questioned, he said nothing. His silence bought him credibility in a world where everyone eventually talked. But violence has a way of leaking into everything it touches. The police began tracking his movements. He'd be pulled over, questioned, released, followed again. Detectives described him as polite but unreadable. One wrote in a report, "Spilotro doesn't blink." That unnerved them more than any threat. His face became known in mugshots, though few victims ever identified him. Fear did the silencing for him. It was around this period that he started hearing rumors about Vegas again. The outfit was making millions off the casinos there. Real money, untraceable, tax-free. But they needed soldiers to protect it. Vegas was a gold mine, but it was also chaos. Everyone wanted a piece. The Teamsters, Kansas City, Milwaukee, even New York. The bosses in Chicago were tired of losing percentages. They wanted control, total and absolute. For that, they needed a man they could trust with violence, but also with discretion. Someone who could run the streets without running his mouth. Anthony didn't know it yet, but his name was already being whispered for that role. He was still busy running collections in Cicero, still proving himself to the men above him. But the walls of Chicago were closing in. The outfit's paranoia was reaching new heights, and every soldier was being watched. Informants were being rooted out, often with a bullet. And in that climate, a man like Spilotro, who never flinched and never confessed, was priceless. There were nights when he'd sit in dim bars, cigarette glowing between his fingers, and wonder what it all meant. Power, fear, respect. He had them, but they came with a loneliness he couldn't shake. His childhood friends were either dead, in prison, or too scared to be seen with him. Even Collada began to notice the distance. Tony had become colder, more methodical, almost detached from the human side of what he did. Maybe he needed to be. In their world, emotion got you killed. By 1962, Spilotro was no longer a name whispered in corners. He was on the lips of every man who mattered in Chicago's underworld. He'd proven himself over and over, and now the bosses were watching to see how far he'd go. When Joe Pesci summoned him again, Anthony didn't ask why. He showed up, as he always did, clean suit, sharp eyes, silent. Pesci poured him a drink, studied him like a piece of machinery that had performed flawlessly. Then he said, "You ever been to Vegas?" Anthony didn't answer right away. He'd heard the stories, the money, the glamour, the blood. Vegas was another world, and men who went there didn't always come back. Pesci smiled thinly. "You might like it there," he said. "Plenty of work, plenty of money, and a lot of people who need reminding who runs things." That was it. No formal promotion, no title, no ceremony. Just an invitation to the desert. A chance to take everything he'd learned in Chicago and carve his own empire out west. The kid from the patch had become the outfit's young blood, a weapon forged in back alleys and sharpened in Cicero's smoke. As he left the bar that night, Chicago's cold wind hit his face, carrying the faint echo of his past. He thought about his father's restaurant, about the smell of marinara and the warmth of family dinners long gone. He thought about the friends buried in unmarked graves. Then he lit a cigarette, looked toward the horizon, and saw the future shimmering like neon in his mind. He didn't know it yet, but Vegas wouldn't just make him rich or powerful. It would make him a legend. And legends, in the world Anthony Spilotro was about to enter, never had happy endings. Chapter 3. The Mad Hatter. A reputation for brutality. The rain came down in thick sheets over Chicago that night, blurring the streetlights into halos of orange and white. A man stumbled out of a bar on the west side, his shirt clinging to his chest, his breath steaming in the cold. He never saw the dark car parked across the street. He never saw the man watching from behind the wheel, cigarette glowing between his fingers like a fuse waiting to burn down. That man was Anthony Spilotro, and tonight wasn't business. It was a test. The kind of job that didn't just prove loyalty, it defined what kind of man you really were. When the door opened and the man's laughter echoed into the rain, Spilotro stepped out of the car, walked across the slick pavement, and vanished into the dark. The next morning, the city woke up to silence. The message had been sent. By the early 1960s, Anthony Spilotro had become more than just another soldier in the Chicago outfit. He was a name people whispered, a reputation built on cold precision and something darker. The bosses called him reliable. The street called him crazy. But the truth was more complicated. He wasn't impulsive. He was deliberate. Violence to him wasn't an explosion. It was a tool, like a craftsman's hammer, used only when necessary and always to make a point. But when he used it, the results were unforgettable. He'd earned his stripes through years of small jobs, collections, beatings, intimidation. But now the outfit trusted him with blood. When someone needed to disappear, when an example needed to be made, Spilotro was the one they called. And that's when the legend began. Chicago had seen killers before, men like Mad Sam DeStefano, who tortured for pleasure. But Tony was different. He didn't scream, didn't rage, didn't get drunk on it. He was calm, quiet, surgical. That calmness unnerved people. It was the same calm you saw in surgeons or executioners. The kind that said this wasn't personal. It was just what had to be done. He was still young, barely in his mid-20s, but already his reputation reached the top. Joe Pesci trusted him. Tony Accardo knew his name. Even Sam Giancana, who ruled Chicago with a mix of charm and violence, respected him. But there were others who feared what he represented. Some of the older guys said the kid was too cold, too unpredictable, that maybe he didn't understand the difference between business and blood. They were half right. Anthony understood it perfectly. He just didn't care about the difference. To him, they were the same thing. Fear was profit, and fear was something he could deliver better than anyone. The turning point came with what the newspapers later called the M&M murders. Two small-time thieves named Billy McCarthy and Jimmy Miraglia, who made the fatal mistake of robbing a bar tied to the outfit. It wasn't just a robbery. It was disrespect. And in the world Spilotro came from, disrespect was a death sentence. When the order came down to make an example, he didn't hesitate. The story has been told in whispers for decades, each version more brutal than the last. But the essence remains the same. Tony wanted information, and he was willing to do anything to get it. It was a line even seasoned mobsters hesitated to cross. But he crossed it like it was nothing. When it was over, the message was clear. You don't steal from the outfit. You don't cross Tony the Ant. The police found the bodies days later, mutilated beyond recognition. Even hardened detectives looked away. Word of what happened spread fast through Chicago's underworld. Men who'd once laughed at the small kid from the patch now crossed the street when they saw him coming. His nickname, the Ant, started to mean something new. Small, yes, but unstoppable. You could crush one, and 1,000 more would come. That was the image that stuck. The murder made Spilotro a star within the outfit. It also marked him as someone who could never again blend into the background. He was feared now, and fear brought power. But it also brought attention. Cops began following him. Federal agents started asking questions. Reporters sniffed around his name. It didn't matter. Spilotro wasn't hiding. If anything, he seemed to enjoy it. There was a strange pride in the way he carried himself after that. He'd walk into restaurants where cops were eating, nod politely, and sit down at the next table. No smirk, no defiance, just a quiet acknowledgement that they couldn't touch him. And most of the time, they didn't. Violence had made him valuable, but it also isolated him. Even within the mob, some men started keeping their distance. They respected him, but respect in that world often came wrapped in fear. He was useful, yes, but he made people uneasy. They said he had dead man's eyes. You could talk to him for 10 minutes and never see emotion flicker across his face. It was like talking to a shadow. Some thought that was an act. It wasn't. For Spilotro, emotion was a weakness. In his world, hesitation could get you killed. So he taught himself to feel nothing at all. He lived modestly then, at least on paper. A small apartment, a car that didn't draw attention. The flashy suits and gold watches came later, when Vegas money started rolling in. But even then, there was something unsettling about his calmness. Neighbors said he was polite, quiet, always said hello. No one ever heard arguments or music or laughter coming from his apartment. Just silence. That was Anthony, always silent until he needed to make noise. Frank Collada stayed close during this period, running jobs with him, learning from him, and sometimes fearing him. They were friends, but even Collada admitted years later that friendship with Tony had limits. He was a good guy to have on your side, Collada said, but if he got on his bad side, you were done. There was no talking him out of it. Once he made up his mind, that was it. That finality defined Spilotro's power. It wasn't just that he was violent. It was that his violence was inevitable. The outfit used that to their advantage. They sent him to clean up messes other men couldn't. Unpaid debts, stubborn business owners, union agitators, anything that needed pressure. He didn't always resort to murder, but when he did, it was calculated. He'd watch his target for days, learn their routines, know when they left, where they went, who they loved. Then he'd strike fast, clean, and without witnesses. It wasn't about killing for pleasure. It was about control. The world made sense when he was in control. But Chicago was changing. Law enforcement was beginning to close in on organized crime like never before. Wiretaps, surveillance, undercover agents. Things the old bosses barely understood were now daily threats. And with each new crackdown, the outfit needed to move its focus somewhere safer, somewhere that money flowed freely and cops looked the other way. That place was Las Vegas, the city of lights and illusion. The outfit already had its hooks in Vegas, of course. They'd been skimming casino profits for years through front companies and Teamster loans. But now they wanted control. They wanted someone on the ground, someone who could protect their interests, keep everyone in line, and remind the casino operators where their loyalty belonged. Tony Accardo and IUPA began discussing who that man should be. They needed someone with a reputation for loyalty, brutality, and silence. Spilotro's name was on everyone's lips. But before Vegas, there were more tests. Chicago's streets had to be cleaned. The outfit was tightening its ranks, purging weak links and informants. Spilotro was involved in several disappearances during that time, though none were ever proven. Men would vanish, and their names would never be spoken again. The FBI started keeping a file on him, noting his movements, his associations, his uncanny ability to appear everywhere and nowhere at once. They didn't have enough to arrest him, but they had enough to worry. At home, his personal life was barely that. A routine of late nights, phone calls, and silence. He dated a few women, but nothing serious. The life he'd chosen didn't allow for closeness. Everyone in his orbit was temporary. His mother still prayed for him. His father kept quiet, pretending not to see the man his son had become. Family dinners were polite, but the air was always thick with things unsaid. Anthony loved his family in his own way, but he had already accepted that he belonged to something else now. The mob wasn't just his job, it was his identity. When he wasn't working, he spent time in bars around Cicero, drinking quietly, always alert. He had an uncanny ability to sense danger before it arrived. Once, when a cop followed him into a tavern, Spilotro turned to him and said, "You're wasting your time. I don't leave fingerprints." The cop never came back. That kind of confidence, calm, unflinching, made him untouchable for a while. People said he had a sixth sense for survival. Others said he was just lucky. But luck runs out eventually. His rise through the outfit was swift, but not without tension. Some of the older enforcers resented him. They saw in him a reflection of their own fading power, a new breed of mobster who didn't play by the old codes of honor. Tony wasn't interested in ceremony or hierarchy. He respected power, not tradition. That made him dangerous, even to his allies. But it also made him the perfect tool for the bosses, who needed soldiers without sentiment. The M&M murders had turned him into a myth, but myths attract attention. Law enforcement pressure increased, and the outfit decided it was time to relocate some of its key men. IUPA called Spilotro into his office one cold afternoon. The conversation was short. "Vegas," IUPA said. "You'll go out there, keep an eye on our interests, make sure nobody gets cute. There's good money. You'll like it." Anthony didn't ask questions. He just nodded. But inside, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Anticipation. Chicago had made him, but it had also trapped him. In Vegas, he could start fresh, build something of his own, carve out a kingdom under the desert sun. He didn't realize yet that the same violence that made him powerful in Chicago would destroy him in Nevada. The desert had its own rules. And in Vegas, everyone played with masks on. Before he left, he tied up loose ends in Chicago. One more job, one more message. It was winter, the air sharp as glass. He met with a man who'd been skimming from the outfit's betting operations. The man pleaded, offered excuses, money, apologies. Anthony listened, nodded, and when the man was done, he said softly, "You should have come clean earlier." That was the last thing the man ever heard. By the time he boarded the plane to Las Vegas, the legend of Tony the Ant had solidified. The newspapers called him a suspect. The mob called him reliable. The cops called him untouchable. But underneath the bravado, there was something else, a seed of arrogance that would one day grow into tragedy. He believed he could control everything. Men, fear, fate itself. In his mind, he was untouchable because he'd already faced death and survived. As the plane lifted off, Chicago's lights spread beneath him like a constellation of ghosts. Every street held memories, every shadow a lesson. He'd learned to rule through fear, to trust no one, to keep his own heart locked away. Now, he was headed for a city where fear and greed danced together under neon lights. A city that promised riches but demanded souls in return. He leaned back in his seat, closed his eyes, and smiled faintly. Somewhere deep down, he knew the next chapter of his life would make him more powerful than ever, and more hunted than he could imagine. For the first time in years, Anthony Spilotro felt alive again. The streets of Chicago had built the monster. Las Vegas was about to unleash him. Chapter 4. Vegas bound, the outfit expands west. The desert was the color of dust and silence, stretching endlessly beneath the burning Nevada sun. There was nothing gentle about it. It could swallow a man whole, leave no trace but his bones. And yet, from that barren wasteland, a city had risen, a glittering mirage of money, sin, and illusion. Las Vegas. In the late 1960s, it was a gambler's dream and a criminal's paradise, where the law was flexible and cash flowed like water. For the Chicago outfit, it was the perfect frontier. And for Anthony Spilotro, freshly arrived from the blood-soaked streets of Chicago, it was destiny. When his plane touched down at McCarran Airport, Tony stepped out into the dry heat and blinked against the sunlight. He'd seen pictures of Vegas, but nothing could have prepared him for the sound. The ceaseless hum of slot machines, the laughter spilling out of casino doors, the constant rhythm of greed beating beneath the neon lights. This wasn't Chicago. This was something else entirely. Back home, power was hidden behind walls and whispers. Here, it sparkled right in your face. Vegas was a city built by hustlers, dreamers, and killers. And now, Tony the Ant was here to make sure it stayed that way. The outfit had already established its hold. Through Teamster loans and front companies, they controlled several major casinos, the Stardust, the Fremont, the Hacienda, and the Marina. Money skimmed from their counting rooms was flown straight back to Chicago, untaxed and unseen. The system was simple, elegant, and wildly profitable. But profits brought greed, and greed brought risk. Every casino was crawling with rival families, small-time thieves, and ambitious operators looking to grab a slice of the pie. The bosses back in Chicago needed someone to keep order, someone who didn't ask questions and didn't hesitate to act. That was Anthony's job. Officially, he was a businessman opening a jewelry store called the Gold Rush. Unofficially, he was the outfit's enforcer, its eyes, ears, and fists in the desert. He settled into Vegas quietly. No grand entrances, no newspaper headlines. Just another face in a city full of faces. But behind that calm exterior, he was already studying everything. Who ran the casinos, who handled the skim, who was loyal, who was weak. The Chicago bosses had paired him with Frank Lefty Rosenthal, a gambling genius who managed their casino interests under the radar. Rosenthal was the opposite of Tony, smooth, calculating, more comfortable behind ledgers than in alleys. Together, they made an unlikely team. Rosenthal handled the money. Spilotro handled the mess. At first, it worked beautifully. The skim ran like clockwork. Every month, hundreds of thousands of dollars were shaved off casino profits, packed into hidden compartments, and shipped back to Chicago through trusted couriers. The bosses were thrilled. Las Vegas was theirs, and Spilotro was their insurance policy. If someone stole, cheated, or even whispered about the skim, Tony made sure they never did it again. It was business, and business was booming. But Spilotro wasn't built to stay behind the scenes. Vegas was a city of temptation, and it didn't take long for his darker instincts to resurface. The glittering lights, the endless flow of money, the parade of hustlers and crooks. It was like a playground for a man who thrived on control. He started surrounding himself with street guys, small-time thieves, and old Chicago connections. Frank Collada soon joined him, along with other familiar faces from back home. They formed a tight crew, running burglaries and robberies on the side, while maintaining the illusion of legitimacy. To most, Tony was just a local businessman. To those who knew better, he was the law in Las Vegas, the kind of law that didn't involve courts or judges. The city suited him. There were no freezing Chicago winters, no narrow alleys, no old men in back rooms barking orders. Here, he was free to operate on instinct. The casinos gave him access to power. The desert gave him a place to bury problems. It was perfect, but Vegas also had eyes everywhere. The FBI had been tracking organized crime's infiltration of the city for years, and Tony's arrival didn't go unnoticed. Agents began following him, photographing him, wiretapping phones. Still, they couldn't touch him. He was too careful. Every deal was verbal. Every order passed face to face. He left no paper trail, no witnesses. To the FBI, he was a ghost in a town full of shadows. The partnership with Rosenthal was complicated. On paper, they respected each other. In reality, they were two different species. Frank lived for the numbers, the odds, the percentages, the science of gambling. Tony lived for control, the rush of knowing that every man in the room feared him, even the ones who smiled. Frank thought violence was bad for business. Tony thought fear was the best business there was. But for a while, their goals aligned. They both wanted to keep Vegas running smoothly, and they both knew how fragile the balance was. Tony operated like a general overseeing occupied territory. He'd stroll into casinos unannounced, scanning the floor with those cold eyes, making sure everyone was where they should be. Dealers straightened up when he passed. Managers stopped mid-sentence. Even the pit bosses lowered their voices. He didn't have to say a word. His presence was enough. To him, control wasn't about yelling. It was about the silence that followed when you entered a room. But Vegas wasn't just the outfit's playground. Other crime families had their hands in the game. The Cleveland mob, Kansas City, Milwaukee. Tensions simmered beneath the surface. Everyone wanted a bigger cut. Everyone watched everyone else. Tony found himself navigating a web of alliances and rivalries, where one wrong move could spark a war. He handled it the only way he knew how, with intimidation. If a rival crew encroached on Chicago's territory, he sent a message. Sometimes that message was a broken arm. Sometimes it was a missing person. He was careful not to draw unnecessary heat, but Vegas had a way of magnifying everything. Rumors spread. Stories grew. People began calling him the outfits man in Vegas, a title that carried both power and danger. The FBI ramped up its surveillance, hoping to catch him slipping. They tailed him from casinos to bars, from meetings to restaurants. He always seemed to know. He'd look straight into the agent's car windows, flash a grin, and drive away. They hated him for it. Meanwhile, Tony's side business flourished. His jewelry store became a front for fencing stolen goods, diamonds, watches, cash. He and his crew were pulling jobs all over town, hitting high-end homes and businesses with surgical precision. It was during this time that the foundation of what would later become the Hole-in-the-Wall gang began to form. Vegas had never seen anything like them. They were ghosts, breaking through walls instead of doors, taking what they wanted and vanishing without a trace. For now, though, it was small scale, a quiet side hustle beneath the blinding light of the casinos. Yet, as his influence grew, so did his arrogance. The old Chicago discipline began to fade. Tony started believing Vegas was his kingdom, not the outfits. He spent more time socializing, flashing jewelry, entertaining women, and basking in the power that came with fear. The bosses back home noticed. They tolerated his excesses as long as the money flowed, but they whispered about his temper, his unpredictability. In the mob, pride was a dangerous thing. It blinded you to the fact that you were never truly in charge. Despite his confidence, Vegas was a powder keg. The skim operations were under constant threat, from law enforcement, rival families, and even the casino owners themselves. It was Rosenthal who kept it all balanced, juggling the finances with near-genius precision. But Rosenthal's legal troubles and ego were beginning to cause friction with the authorities, putting everything at risk. Tony's job was to make sure no one panicked, no one talked, and no one forgot who was in control. He excelled at that part. He loved the desert, not for its beauty but for its usefulness. To him, it was like an ocean, vast, silent, and capable of swallowing anything. There were stories about men who'd driven out there with Tony and never returned. No one ever found bodies. No one ever asked questions. In Vegas, people disappeared all the time. The heat, the sand, the wind, they erased evidence better than any hitman could. It was the perfect ecosystem for a man like Spilotro. Still, there were cracks forming. His crew was growing restless. Some wanted bigger scores, others wanted out. Frank Collada was loyal, but he saw the danger. Tony was getting reckless, he later said. He thought he could do anything. Vegas made him crazy. It wasn't madness, not exactly. It was invincibility. For years, Tony had gotten away with everything. Cops couldn't touch him. Rivals feared him. The bosses needed him. In his mind, he'd beaten the system. He started throwing his weight around more openly, demanding cuts from other operations, muscling in a territory that wasn't his. The outfit began receiving complaints. Joe Pesci warned him to tone it down, to remember his place. Tony nodded respectfully, then ignored it. Vegas was his world now. Chicago was a memory. He'd walk through the stardust at night, neon lights flickering across his face, cigarette smoke curling around him like fog. To the tourists, he was just another sharp-dressed man at the tables. To those who knew, he was the reason everyone stayed in line. He'd lean close to a pit boss, whisper a few words, and the man's hands would tremble for days after. Tony liked that feeling, the quiet control, the unspoken power. He was the king of shadows, ruling an empire made of fear. But every kingdom has its enemies, and every rise casts a long shadow. The FBI was closing in. The Nevada Gaming Control Board had begun investigating Rosenthal's operations, and whispers were reaching Chicago about Tony's growing ego. Some said he was stealing from the skim. Others said he was becoming a liability. The bosses didn't believe it yet, but they were watching. They always watched. Tony didn't care. He felt untouchable. He built a life where everyone either feared or obeyed him. He had money, women, influence, and a city that bent around his will. The desert stretched before him like an open grave and an open promise all at once. He thought he'd mastered it, conquered it. But Vegas wasn't like Chicago. Chicago rewarded loyalty. Vegas devoured it. As the years rolled on, the tension between him and Rosenthal began to simmer. Frank saw Tony's recklessness as a threat to everything they built. Tony saw Frank's arrogance as weakness. It was an inevitable collision, two men from different worlds holding the same gun by opposite ends. For now, though, the lights still shimmered, the cash still flowed, and the bosses were still happy. Tony Spilotro had arrived in Vegas and turned it into his personal empire. The kid from the patch was now the desert's most feared enforcer, a man whose name carried the weight of death itself. But in Las Vegas, nothing stays hidden forever. The same lights that gave him power would soon expose everything he tried to keep in the dark. And when they did, not even the desert would be enough to bury what came next. Chapter 5. The Hole-in-the-Wall Gang, building his Vegas crew. The night was quiet, too quiet for Las Vegas. The Strip still glowed, of course. It always did. But out near the edge of town, where the lights faded and the desert began to swallow sound, a handful of men crouched behind a jewelry store. They were dressed in black, faces hidden under ski masks, gloves tight around trembling hands. The leader stood a few feet back, watching the building with an expression that never seemed to change. His eyes were sharp, calm, unreadable. He nodded once. That was all it took. A man raised a sledgehammer, swung hard, and the wall cracked open with a low, dull thud. Dust poured out. That was how they did it. Through the walls, never the doors. It was quiet, efficient, and unmistakably their signature. The Hole-in-the-Wall Gang had arrived, and at its center stood Anthony Spilotro, the outfit's enforcer turned Vegas kingpin, a man who had transformed a glittering city of gamblers into a personal hunting ground. The crew didn't start big. It began with trust, the kind of trust only men who've already shared blood can build. Tony brought in his old friend Frank Collada first. Frank was street smart, brash, and loyal to the bone, but also unpredictable. Together, They'd done everything back in Chicago: robberies, collections, shakedowns, and both of them had survived things that should have buried them. When Tony called, Frank didn't hesitate. He packed his bags and flew to Vegas. From there, the group grew, one criminal at a time. Burglars, safecrackers, wheelmen, con artists. Each one had a specialty. Tony didn't want soldiers. He wanted craftsmen. He ran the crew like a general running a black ops team. Every job was planned to the smallest detail. Every route mapped. Every getaway rehearsed. He didn't tolerate mistakes. Not ever. A single wrong move could bring heat from the feds or attention from Chicago, and both could be fatal. So Tony made sure everyone understood the rules. They worked clean, fast, and loyal. And above all else, they worked for him. Las Vegas was the perfect playground for a man like Spilotro. The city glittered with opportunity. Tourists carried cash, casinos overflowed with riches, and jewelry stores brimmed with diamonds and gold. Behind the glamour, though, it was chaos. 1,000 hustles running at once, each vulnerable to the right kind of predator. That's what Tony and his men became, the predators in paradise. They'd hit homes of high rollers, pawn shops, hotel vaults. It wasn't about need. It was about dominance. Every heist was a declaration that Vegas belonged to them. The hole in the wall name came from their signature move. Rather than breaking in through doors or windows, they literally cut through walls, ceilings, or adjoining buildings to avoid alarms and security systems. It was smart, brutal, and poetic in its simplicity. The first few hits were flawless. They'd slip in at night, take everything, and vanish before dawn. The police were baffled. Newspapers called them ghosts. To Tony, it was more than theft, it was artistry. Each job reminded him of his power. Every successful hit was a quiet laugh in the face of law enforcement, and even the outfit back home. But running a crew was different from enforcing for Chicago. The men under him weren't soldiers bound by mob code. They were criminals chasing money. They admired him, feared him, but they weren't blind. They knew Tony's temper. They'd seen what he did to people who disobeyed. He ruled them with the same cold precision he'd shown in Chicago. But out here, there was no one to rein him in. Vegas made him believe he was untouchable, and that belief began to rot everything around him. Frank Collada became his right hand, the voice of reason when Tony's impulses ran hot. But even Frank could see the change. Tony wasn't the same man he'd been back in the patch. The Vegas sun had baked away whatever restraint he once had. He was paranoid, suspicious of everyone, always convinced someone was talking to the FBI or stealing from the outfit. When he suspected disloyalty, he didn't ask questions. He acted. There were beatings, threats, and worse. His reputation grew darker, but so did his reach. People whispered that Tony the Ant had become more than a gangster. He was a force of nature, something beyond rules or fear. He started to expand his influence beyond the crew. Bookies, loan sharks, and low-level hustlers all kicked up money to him. Casino employees who skimmed on the side paid him for protection. He inserted himself into every corner of Vegas's criminal ecosystem. If there was a dollar made illegally, Tony wanted a piece of it. He was no longer just protecting the outfit's interests. He was building his own empire. That didn't sit well with Chicago. The bosses wanted him to keep order, not to become one. But Tony didn't care. The desert felt far away from Chicago's reach. Out here, he was judge, jury, and executioner. He built his reputation on fear, and it worked. People were terrified of him. Stories about his brutality spread like wildfire. Some were true, others exaggerated, but all had the same effect. A thief who tried to rob a casino cage vanished and was later found in the desert, unrecognizable. A jeweler who shorted Tony on a deal was discovered beaten so badly that his own wife couldn't identify him. The message was clear. Tony didn't make threats. He made examples. Still, beneath the violence, there was method. He wasn't a madman, despite what the FBI files claimed. He was strategic. Every move had a purpose. He'd hit a jewelry store not just for cash, but to remind its owner who controlled the street. He'd discipline his men, not for fun, but to keep order. The hole-in-the-wall gang wasn't chaos. It was precision disguised as mayhem. They didn't just rob, they dominated. But Vegas was changing. The FBI was growing smarter, more organized, and more relentless. They'd learned from their failures in Chicago. Now they had surveillance teams, informants, and a hunger for a big name. And Spilotro's name was as big as they came. They bugged phones, watched casinos, tracked his movements. Every week, they collected photographs, Tony entering restaurants, meeting with Frank Rosenthal, laughing with known mobsters. They wanted a connection, a thread that tied him directly to the outfit skim. Tony knew they were watching. Sometimes he'd even wave to the unmarked cars following him. He found it amusing at first, almost flattering. But deep down, it planted a seed of paranoia. He began questioning everyone, his friends, his crew, even Rosenthal. That paranoia spread like smoke through his operations. Jobs became sloppy. Trust began to fracture. Frank Collada noticed it early. Tony was losing his edge, he later said. He thought he could control everyone, but in the end, he couldn't control himself. Tony started making impulsive decisions, targeting people who weren't threats, drawing unnecessary attention. The once perfect heist began to leave clues, fingerprints, tire marks, witnesses. The cops started closing in. And yet, even as the noose tightened, Tony didn't slow down. If anything, he doubled down. The crew's robberies became more ambitious, riskier. They hit bigger stores, richer homes, higher stakes. It was as if Tony believed he could outrun fate through sheer momentum. Each success fed his ego. Each close call hardened his resolve. The hole-in-the-wall gang was no longer just a side hustle. It was an obsession. The irony was that while Tony built his criminal empire, he also craved legitimacy. He wanted respect, not just fear. He opened legitimate businesses, restaurants, bars, jewelry shops, but everyone knew what they really were. Fronts. Still, he played the part, attending dinners, shaking hands, pretending to be a businessman while his men drilled through walls under moonlight. It was theater, and Tony loved being the star. But the outfit didn't appreciate the performance. Chicago bosses began hearing complaints. Vegas was drawing too much attention, and Tony was at the center of it. They needed silence, and all he delivered was noise. Joe Pesci sent word to tone it down, to stop running side jobs and focus on the skim. Tony ignored him. He told his crew, "They don't understand how it works out here. This is my town." It was the first open act of defiance, and it didn't go unnoticed. One night, after a failed job where the crew barely escaped a police trap, Tony called a meeting. The men sat around a small table, exhausted, their faces drawn and pale. He paced in front of them, his voice low but sharp. "You think this is a game?" he said. "This is my name, my city. You screw up again, you're done." His tone wasn't anger. It was ice, the kind of cold that made even killers feel small. No one said a word, but something in the room had shifted. They weren't afraid of getting caught anymore. They were afraid of him. That fear kept them loyal, but also created distance. Frank Collada began to see cracks in Tony's armor. He was restless, distracted, reckless with women, careless with money. He'd spend hours at the casinos, betting big, acting invincible. The man who once calculated every move now played dice with his own fate. Collada started keeping his own secrets, just in case. And in the mob, once you started keeping secrets, the end was never far. Despite the growing tension, the hole-in-the-wall gang's legend grew. Their heists became the stuff of whispers, how they could break into any building, bypass any alarm, vanish before the cops even arrived. They became folk heroes to some, nightmares to others. But behind every job, the pressure mounted. The FBI was closing in. Informants were talking. Even Rosenthal had begun distancing himself from Tony, wary of the chaos that followed him everywhere. By the late 70s, Tony was juggling too many lives. The enforcer for Chicago, the self-made kingpin of Vegas, the leader of a crew that operated on fear, the friend to a casino mastermind, and the husband and father trying to appear legitimate. None of it fit together anymore. It was all smoke and mirrors, and sooner or later, the illusion would break. But Tony didn't see it that way. He believed he could hold it all together, that he could keep his empire standing through sheer will. He'd build it from nothing, brick by brick, lie by lie, and he refused to believe it could crumble. Even as the FBI tightened their net, even as Chicago whispered about his recklessness, he convinced himself he was in control. There's a moment men like Tony always face, a moment when they stand at the top and mistake the view for safety. That's where he was untouchable, unstoppable, and unknowingly doomed. He couldn't see that the men around him were starting to waver. That loyalty built on fear has a short shelf life. Frank Collada, the man who'd followed him across the country, was beginning to feel the weight of it all. The raids, the heat, the killings. And one day soon, that loyalty would break. But on this night, as the crew gathered for another job under the cold desert stars, none of that mattered. Tony gave the signal. The hammer swung. The wall cracked open, spilling plaster and dust into the night air. Inside, the glow of the casino lights shimmered on the stolen gold and diamonds they'd soon claim. For a brief moment, it felt like victory, like immortality. Tony Spilotro smiled, a rare, fleeting smile. He didn't know it yet, but the cracks in the wall weren't just in the buildings they broke into. They were in his empire, in his crew, in himself. And soon, those cracks would swallow everything. Chapter 6. Frank Rosenthal, the brain behind the tables. The neon outside the stardust flickered against the night sky like a pulse. Steady, electric, alive. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke, perfume, and the clatter of chips. Dealers called out bets with rehearsed monotony. Cocktail waitresses weaved through crowds, and the hum of money filled the room like static. This was Frank Rosenthal's world, a world built on numbers, precision, and the illusion of chance. And in the middle of it all, watching from a quiet corner with a face carved in stone, was Anthony Spilotro. Two men, opposites in every way, tied together by one thing, the Chicago outfit. Before Vegas knew his name, Frank Lefty Rosenthal was already a legend in the underground gambling circuit. He wasn't a gangster. He was something rarer, a genius. The kind of man who could calculate odds in his head faster than a computer, who saw patterns where others saw chaos. In Chicago, he had managed illegal sports books and betting operations for the outfit, turning them into money machines that never ran dry. But Frank's ambition was bigger than Chicago. He wanted legitimacy. He wanted the lights. Vegas was his dream, the place where he could run casinos the way he ran numbers, clean, efficient, and under total control. The outfit gave him that chance. Through Teamster loans and strawmen, they gained silent control over several casinos in Las Vegas. But they couldn't be seen running them directly. They needed someone who could manage the business without drawing heat. Frank was perfect for it. He became the quiet architect of the outfit's empire on the Strip, pulling strings behind the scenes, making the casinos dance to the rhythm of his calculations. But as brilliant as he was, Frank had one problem. Las Vegas wasn't built on logic. It was built on people, greedy, unpredictable, and dangerous. And to handle those people, the outfit sent him a weapon. They sent Tony. Their partnership began with respect. Frank admired Tony's ability to keep order, to make people fall in line without needing to raise his voice. Tony admired Frank's brain, the way he could turn chaos into profit. For a time, it was symbiotic. Frank ran the numbers. Tony handled the muscle. It was like a perfect balance between intellect and intimidation. But perfection never lasts in their world. At first, Frank didn't want anything to do with him. He thought Tony was a liability, a thug in a city that rewarded sophistication. But when a casino employee tried to pocket money from the count room, and Tony handled the problem so quietly that it barely made a ripple, Frank changed his mind. He realized the value of having a man like Spilotro on his side, a man who could solve problems the law couldn't touch. Their alliance was born not out of friendship, but necessity. One handled the books, the other handled the bodies. To the outside world, Frank Rosenthal was the face of success. He hosted television shows, mingled with celebrities, dressed like a movie star. He had a sharp tongue, a sharper mind, and a need for control that bordered on obsession. He ran the Stardust, the Fremont, the Hacienda, and the Marina with the precision of a military commander. Every dollar was tracked, every dealer monitored, every game rigged just enough to ensure the house always won. Under his management, profits soared. The outfit was ecstatic. Chicago called him a miracle worker. But behind the polished exterior, the pressure was immense. The casinos were crawling with federal agents, inspectors, and informants. Frank knew one mistake could expose everything. He trusted no one completely. Not his employees, not his business partners, and certainly not the man Chicago had sent to protect him. Tony might have been useful, but he was unpredictable. He wasn't built for subtlety. Frank liked control, Tony liked fear. It was only a matter of time before those two philosophies collided. Their relationship was complex. They shared meals, drank together, laughed at times, but beneath the surface was a quiet tension, two predators circling the same territory. Frank saw himself as the mastermind, the brains behind the empire. Tony saw himself as its enforcer, the protector of everything Frank built. But Tony's protection came with a price. He demanded respect, deference, acknowledgement. And Frank, proud and arrogant, wasn't the kind of man who bowed to anyone. The more successful he became, the more he treated Tony like an employee rather than a partner. To a man like Spilotro, that was dangerous ground. Still, for years, it worked. Vegas flourished under their uneasy alliance. The outfit's skim operation ran smoother than ever. Millions of dollars vanished off the books, funneled quietly back to Chicago. The FBI knew something was happening, but couldn't prove it. Every time they got close, evidence disappeared, witnesses changed their stories, and the trail went cold. It was a symphony of corruption, and both men played their parts beautifully. But Tony was changing. The longer he stayed in Vegas, the less he acted like a soldier. He was becoming a boss in his own right. He started using his connection to Frank as leverage, inserting himself deeper into casino affairs. Dealers, pit bosses, and managers learned quickly that if Tony wanted something, you gave it to him. He began demanding free credit, fixing games, muscling his way into legitimate businesses. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about power. Frank hated it. Every time Tony walked onto the casino floor, tension followed. People froze. Customers noticed. And for Frank, who thrived on the illusion of class and control, it was a nightmare. He confronted Tony more than once. "You can't do this," he told him. "You're drawing too much attention." Tony just stared, expressionless. "I keep people in line," he said. "That's what I do." To him, it was that simple. But to Frank, it was reckless. Their partnership began to fracture. Frank thought Tony was jeopardizing everything they'd built. Tony thought Frank was forgetting who kept him safe. The cracks were widening, and neither man realized how deep they would go. At home, Frank's personal life was unraveling. His marriage to Jerry, a beautiful but troubled former showgirl, was falling apart. She drank too much, spent too freely, and carried the ghost of a past filled with hustlers and chaos. Frank tried to control her the same way he controlled his casinos, with logic and money. But Jerry wasn't a game of chance he could rig. She was unpredictable, impulsive, and dangerously drawn to the dark charisma of Tony Spilotro. It started with whispers. Jerry spending too much time around Tony, long conversations, stolen glances. At first, Frank dismissed it as paranoia. He was too busy, too focused on running the casinos to notice the emotional earthquake forming under his own roof. But the rumors grew louder, and when he finally faced the truth, it hit him harder than any bullet could have. The woman he loved was having an affair with a man sent to protect him. Tony didn't deny it. In his mind, it wasn't betrayal, it was power. Sleeping with Frank's wife wasn't about lust. It was about dominance, about proving that even the smartest man in Vegas couldn't control everything. It was the beginning of the end. The partnership that had once defined Vegas's golden years now became a ticking time bomb. Frank's behavior grew erratic. He lashed out at casino executives, argued with state regulators, and refused to play by the rules. When the Nevada Gaming Commission finally banned him from running casinos, it was the ultimate humiliation. He blamed Tony for everything: the scrutiny, the downfall, the betrayal. Tony, in turn, saw Frank as ungrateful, weak, and too proud to accept that his time was over. By the early 1980s, their alliance was dead. They barely spoke except through intermediaries. The outfit, tired of the drama, began to lose patience. The Vegas operation was crumbling under investigations, indictments, and paranoia. The bosses wanted quiet, and all Tony brought was noise. They'd tolerated him for years because he delivered results. But now he was out of control, robbing houses, running independent rackets, sleeping with wives, and drawing the kind of attention that got people killed. Frank's near-death in 1982 only deepened the rift. He'd been driving home when his Cadillac exploded in a fireball, hurling him from the car. Miraculously, he survived. No one ever proved who planted the bomb, but everyone had theories. Some said it was Chicago, punishing him for his arrogance. Others whispered it was Tony, finally tying up loose ends. Frank never named names, but he never forgave. In his mind, there was no doubt who had wanted him gone. The city that had made him a legend had turned into a graveyard of friends and loyalty. Meanwhile, Tony was spiraling. The hole-in-the-wall gang had been exposed, his men arrested, and his empire cracking under pressure. The FBI had enough evidence to tie him to countless crimes. Informants were turning. His brother Michael, who'd followed him to Vegas hoping for a slice of the American dream, was now caught in the storm. And Chicago had grown silent. Silence was never a good sign. The partnership that began as the perfect balance between brains and muscle ended in ashes. Frank escaped Vegas alive but broken, hiding behind interviews and bitterness. Tony stayed, convinced he could still control the chaos. But the city had changed. Vegas wasn't the wild frontier it used to be. The government had tightened its grip, corporations were taking over the casinos, and the days of mob control were ending. Tony didn't see it. He couldn't. His pride wouldn't let him. He walked through the casinos less often now. The pit bosses no longer looked at him with fear, just pity. The new management avoided his gaze. The FBI agents watching him didn't hide anymore. He'd once ruled this city from the shadows, but now the shadows were shrinking. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he must have known that his story was heading toward a wall he couldn't punch through. Frank Rosenthal left Las Vegas behind, but his ghost lingered. Every table, every slot machine, every hotel floor still carried traces of his perfectionism, his obsession with control. And Tony, the man who had once enforced that control, now found himself in a city that no longer needed him. The empire they built together had consumed them both, one with fire, the other with silence. Two men, one city, and a dream that devoured everything it touched. Tony Spilotro's world was closing in, and somewhere far away, the Chicago bosses were already whispering about what had to be done. Chapter 7. Love, Lust, and Betrayal. The affair with Jerry Rosenthal. The desert night was still, the air heavy with the kind of silence that only comes before something breaks. Somewhere off the strip, inside a dimly lit house filled with mirrors and cigarette smoke, Anthony Spilotro sat across from Jerry Rosenthal. The tension between them wasn't spoken, but it vibrated through the room like a low hum. She was stunning in that fragile, cinematic way, eyes that flickered between warmth and ruin, a smile that belonged in a photograph, and a sadness that seemed permanent, like perfume clinging to her skin. Jerry was the kind of woman men tried to save and ended up destroying themselves for. And Tony, despite everything he'd learned about control and silence, was no exception. Their paths had always been destined to cross. Las Vegas was small when it came to power, and even smaller when it came to sin. Frank Rosenthal, Jerry's husband, ran the outfit's casino empire with the precision of a surgeon, but he couldn't fix what was broken at home. Their marriage had become a cold, glittering performance. Expensive cars, public smiles, private warfare. Jerry felt trapped, living in a mansion built on numbers and paranoia. Frank didn't love her anymore. He managed her. She was another account to balance, another risk to minimize. And then came Tony, the man who offered what Frank couldn't: danger, freedom, and attention that burned instead of calculated. At first, it was nothing more than flirtation. Jerry had seen Tony around the casinos, standing quietly in the background, always watching but rarely speaking. She'd heard the rumors, the violence, the killings, the way men vanished after crossing him. But there was something magnetic about him. He wasn't loud or crude like most mobsters. He had a stillness that drew people in, the kind of calm that made you lean closer, even when you knew you shouldn't. She once told a friend, "Tony makes you feel safe and scared at the same time." That was his power. He didn't chase her. That wasn't his style. He didn't need to. She was drawn to him, like everyone else who orbiting his world too long. One night, after a party at the Stardust, she found herself alone in his car, the city lights sliding across the windshield like falling stars. She said something about how Frank didn't even look at her anymore. Tony didn't respond. He just glanced at her, eyes unreadable, and for a long second, she thought he might say something kind. Instead, he said, "Maybe he's afraid of what he'd see." She laughed, unsure if it was an insult or a compliment. It didn't matter. That was the moment something shifted between them. What started as stolen conversations became secret meetings. He'd visit her when Frank was out, sometimes under the pretense of business, sometimes for nothing at all. He'd sit in her living room, suit perfectly pressed, shoes polished, and talk about anything but himself. Jerry filled the silence with stories, her past, her regrets, her loneliness. Tony would listen, occasionally smiling, occasionally saying something sharp that cut through her self-pity. He never promised her anything. He didn't need to. Just being near him made her feel seen in a way Frank never did. To outsiders, it might have looked like love, but it wasn't. It was something darker, an addiction. Jerry was addicted to the thrill of it, to the feeling of being close to danger and pretending she could control it. And Tony, for all his coldness, found something intoxicating in her chaos. She was unpredictable, emotional, alive in a way that his world of order and violence never was. When he looked at her, he saw everything he'd denied himself: emotion, vulnerability, weakness. He hated that he wanted it, but he wanted it all the same. For months, their affair remained hidden, though the whispers grew louder. Vegas was a city of gossip, and secrets didn't stay buried long. Employees noticed things. Tony's car parked too long in the driveway, the way Jerry's eyes followed him when he entered a room. Frank heard the rumors, but refused to believe them. He was too proud, too rational. He convinced himself that Jerry was too smart, that Tony was too loyal. But deep down, something in him knew. He started drinking more, working later, pushing her away further until there was nothing left but resentment and denial. Tony didn't care about the risk. If anything, it thrilled him. Sleeping with Frank Rosenthal's wife wasn't just passion. It was power. It was a quiet rebellion against the man who thought he could run everything with rules and numbers. Tony didn't believe in rules anymore. He'd spent his whole life enforcing other men's codes, and now, in Vegas, he'd made his own. Every time he saw Jerry, he felt like he was daring the world to stop him. It wasn't love, it was conquest. And like all conquests in his life, it couldn't last. Jerry began to unravel. The pressure of living between two powerful men broke something inside her. She'd drink until her hands trembled, then call Tony at 2 a.m, sobbing about how Frank didn't love her, how she didn't know who she was anymore. Tony would come over, calm her down, and then leave before sunrise, as if the daylight might expose what they were doing. He tried to keep control, but even he couldn't manage her spiraling emotions. She was falling apart, and he didn't have the patience or the capacity to save her. Frank finally confronted her one night after hearing her on the phone with Tony. The fight was ugly, loud, full of words that cut deeper than any bullet. Jerry denied everything, then confessed, then denied it again. Frank broke something, a vase, a chair, maybe his own pride, and left the house without looking back. That night marked the end of whatever was left of their marriage. He moved into a hotel suite, threw himself into work, and told himself she was someone else's problem now. But she wasn't. She was still his wife, still tied to his name, and in Vegas, that meant she was still part of his empire. The affair didn't stay private for long. Word reached Chicago, and the bosses were not amused. It wasn't just about morality, it was about discipline. Sleeping with another man's wife, especially a fellow mob associate's, was an unforgivable offense. It showed weakness, recklessness, and lack of control. They didn't care about love or heartbreak. They cared about order. Tony's actions made him look unstable, emotional, traits the outfit despised. Whispers began among the higher-ups that Tony had lost his edge, that he was becoming a liability. But Tony brushed it off. He'd built his reputation on fear, not approval. The bosses back in Chicago could bark all they wanted. He had his own kingdom now. He wasn't their soldier anymore. That arrogance would be his undoing. The relationship with Jerry grew toxic. The more she drank, the more erratic she became. She'd call Frank's casino, screaming into the phone. She'd show up at the Stardust uninvited, demanding to see him, causing scenes that drew headlines. Tony tried to distance himself, but by then, their lives were too entangled. He couldn't separate business from emotion, control from chaos. Jerry had become his weakness, and everyone could see it. Even his crew noticed. One of them once said, "Tony used to scare everyone. Then he started caring about her, and you could see it. He wasn't the same." One night, she showed up at his house drunk, crying, furious. She accused him of using her, of being just like Frank. He didn't yell. He never yelled. He just stood there, letting her rage wash over him like a storm. When she finally broke down and sobbed against his chest, he held her for a moment, staring into the dark, and realized something he couldn't admit even to himself. He didn't feel anything. Not love, not pity, just a hollow sense of inevitability. He knew how this would end. In his world, nothing ever lasted. By the early 80s, the affair had turned into poison. Frank knew, the outfit knew, the FBI knew. Everyone did. It became another thread in the web tightening around Tony. His relationship with Frank, once the foundation of the outfit's success in Vegas, was destroyed. Rosenthal wanted him gone, and Chicago was starting to agree. Tony had turned a profitable operation into a public embarrassment. The bosses were patient men, but their patience was wearing thin. Then came the explosion. October 1982. Frank Rosenthal got into his Cadillac outside a Las Vegas restaurant. Seconds later, the car erupted into flames, the blast echoing through the parking lot. He should have died. By some miracle, he didn't. He crawled out, burned and shaken, but alive. The police found traces of dynamite under the car. No one was charged, but everyone knew who might have wanted him dead. Frank blamed Tony. He never said it publicly, but his silence said enough. From that moment on, there was no going back. Jerry didn't survive the aftermath. Not the explosion, not the chaos, not the guilt. Her life unraveled completely. She spiraled into addiction, lost custody of her children, and in 1982, just months after the bombing, she was found dead in Los Angeles, alone in a hotel room. Officially, it was ruled an overdose. Unofficially, it was heartbreak. She had been swallowed by the same world that had promised her glamour. To Tony, it was another ghost added to the long list of names that followed him. He didn't attend the funeral. He didn't speak of her again. But those close to him said something in him changed after that. Some invisible crack that had always been there finally split wide open. He started lashing out, more violent, more unpredictable. Every betrayal, every loss seemed to twist the knife inside him. The outfit was losing patience, and Vegas was slipping away. What had started as love, or something like it, had turned into a curse. The affair had destroyed his friendship, his reputation, and his standing with the bosses. In the mob's world, Weakness was death, and Tony had shown both. There's a photograph from those years. Tony sitting alone in a restaurant booth, cigarette smoke curling around him, eyes distant. It's a face carved by too many choices, too many ghosts. He looks like a man who's already halfway to his own grave. Maybe he knew it. Maybe he didn't care. Jerry had once told him, "You don't feel anything, do you?" And she was right. Tony's entire life had been built on shutting off his feelings. Fear, guilt, love, all of it. But the one time he let the world in, it burned everything down. Vegas wasn't just the city where he made his name. It was the city that stripped him bare. Love, lust, betrayal. They were all the same thing in Tony's world. Vulnerabilities disguised as pleasures. And in Vegas, vulnerabilities got you killed. He sat in silence that night, staring out at the lights that shimmered endlessly across the desert. Somewhere out there, men were already whispering his name in Chicago, deciding his fate. But for now, Tony just lit another cigarette and exhaled slowly. The woman was gone. The empire was crumbling. And the man who once ruled through silence was now being swallowed by it. Chapter 8. Law enforcement strikes back. The FBI comes to Vegas. The first time Anthony Spilotro noticed the car, he didn't think much of it. A pale blue sedan, parked across from his jewelry shop on Sahara Avenue. Same spot, same angle, every morning. But when it was there 3 days in a row, same time, same driver, no one ever getting out, he smiled. He didn't panic. He didn't even flinch. He just exhaled smoke through his nose, adjusted his cufflinks, and said softly to no one in particular, "They're watching." And from that moment on, they always were. Vegas had changed. What was once a gold mine for organized crime had become a battlefield, and the men coming after the outfit didn't wear suits from Cicero, they wore badges from Washington. The FBI was done watching from afar. They wanted Vegas cleaned out, and they were willing to play dirty to do it. By the late 70s, every casino, every courier, every counting room was under surveillance. Wiretaps hummed on phone lines. Cameras peeked from hotel rooms. Microphones were hidden behind mirrors and bar stools. And at the center of all that noise stood Spilotro, the quiet man with the loudest reputation in the desert. Special Agent Dennis Arnoldi was one of the first to take on the Spilotro file. He'd studied mob cases before, but Vegas was different. It wasn't some backroom gambling racket. It was an empire built in daylight, with celebrities, politicians, and million-dollar hotels. To crack it, Arnoldi needed patience. He started small, following Tony's crew, listening to whispers, building a picture of a man who moved like smoke through a city that pretended not to see him. It didn't take long to realize that Spilotro wasn't just another mobster. He was the spider at the center of the web. The FBI had a nickname for him, the ant with a sting. They knew he was behind the robberies, the extortions, the disappearances. They knew he was connected to the outfit skim operation, the millions being siphoned off from casino profits and flown back to Chicago. What they didn't have was proof. Tony never signed anything. He never used phones for business. He never left fingerprints on anything but glass. Everything he did was verbal, face-to-face, and always cloaked in charm. To an outsider, he was just a businessman. To law enforcement, he was a ghost with blood on his hands. But ghosts leave traces. And Tony's first mistake was believing the desert would always hide them. The hole-in-the-wall gang's robberies had drawn attention, more than he realized. Jewelry stores, restaurants, homes. It wasn't the targets that got people talking, it was the pattern. Each hit was too clean, too fast, too consistent. Someone was organizing it. Someone smart. Detectives started connecting the dots. And every line pointed back to a man who never seemed to be where the crime happened, but always showed up when it was over. The FBI planted bugs near his shop, his home, his favorite restaurants. They followed him through the casinos, tracked his meetings with Rosenthal, recorded conversations with his crew. Tony knew they were there. He could feel in the air, like static before a storm. But he refused to run. Running wasn't his style. He'd outlasted cops in Chicago, reporters, rivals, even his own bosses. He thought he could outlast the feds too. He'd say, "They watch, I smile, they blink first." Only this time, they didn't blink. Vegas law enforcement was changing, driven by men who saw the mob not as an untouchable myth, but as a business problem to solve. They started using money trails, subpoenas, and accountants instead of just guns and raids. They didn't need confessions. They needed ledgers. The casino skim, the very operation Tony was supposed to protect, became their way in. When the FBI began monitoring the Stardust and Fremont's finances, they found discrepancies, tiny gaps in cash flow that added up to millions. Someone was stealing from the casinos. The irony was that someone was the outfit itself. The Bureau's Las Vegas office became a hive of obsession. Agents studied Tony's habits, when he ate, who he met, how he drove. They mapped his movements like a clock, trying to find the moment where myth met evidence. And Tony, whether out of arrogance or fatigue, started getting sloppy. He lingered too long at meetings, talked too freely with his crew, showed up in too many photographs. Every click of a camera shutter was another nail waiting to be driven into his coffin. But Tony wasn't the only one being hunted. The outfit's entire Vegas network was under siege. Frank Rosenthal, already unraveling after his split from Jerry and his growing conflicts with Tony, became a target of constant surveillance. The FBI bugged his casinos, his offices, even his home. They listened as Rosenthal complained about Tony, about Chicago, about how he was surrounded by fools. Every word built the government's case that Vegas wasn't just dirty, it was owned. Meanwhile, Tony's empire started to crumble from within. The hole-in-the-wall gang was getting restless. The more the FBI closed in, the less money there was, the more suspicion brewed. Tony's paranoia spread through the crew like a sickness. He began accusing his own men of talking, of stealing, of turning. Frank Collada, his oldest friend, found himself under increasing scrutiny. Tony didn't trust anyone anymore. He'd built his empire on loyalty, but now he ruled it with fear. And fear, when pushed too far, turns men desperate. The FBI saw it happening and waited. They didn't need to make a move. They needed to let Tony destroy himself. Collada, weary of the pressure, finally cracked after being arrested for robbery. Facing decades in prison and convinced Tony would have him killed, he flipped. He sat down with federal agents and told them everything. How Tony ran the crew, how they broke into buildings, how he'd ordered hits, how he'd bullied casino managers and defied Chicago. It was the confession the Bureau had been waiting for, the missing link that turned rumors into evidence. Overnight, the ghost had a voice. When word of Collada's betrayal reached Tony, he didn't explode. He didn't scream or rant. He just went quiet. That silence was worse than any rage. He'd always known betrayal was part of the game, but this one cut deeper than most. Collada wasn't just another soldier. He was family. They'd grown up together, fought together, built Vegas together. And now, that same loyalty had become the knife in his back. Federal indictments followed, dozens of them. Spilotro's name appeared in connection with robberies, racketeering, conspiracy, even murder. He stood trial multiple times, each one dragging him deeper into the spotlight he hated. In court, he was polite, measured, almost charming. He smiled at reporters, waved to jurors, and wore perfectly tailored suits. The prosecutors painted him as a monster. He played the role of misunderstood businessman. And somehow, for years, he kept walking free. Technicalities, mistrials, lack of evidence. The ghost kept slipping through their fingers. But the pressure was suffocating. His life had become a revolving door of indictments, legal fees, and sleepless nights. The outfit, once proud of its quiet Las Vegas operation, now saw only chaos. Chicago's bosses were furious. Tony had drawn too much heat, too much attention. He was supposed to protect the skim, not make himself the story. The calls for back home grew colder, shorter. When they stopped altogether, Tony knew what it meant. The FBI's biggest breakthrough came when they uncovered the full extent of the skim operation. Wiretaps from Kansas City caught mob bosses discussing the flow of money from Vegas casinos. Agents in Chicago linked it to Teamster loans. And in Vegas, Collada's testimony filled in the rest. It was all connected, a nationwide network of greed stretching from the Neon Strip to the dark streets of Cicero. The Justice Department prepared the largest organized crime case in Nevada's history. Through it all, Tony refused to run. He built a legend on being fearless, and he wouldn't abandon it now. To those close to him, it seemed like defiance. To the FBI, it looked like madness. He'd show up at restaurants, wave to agents staking out his house, even invite reporters to photograph him walking his dog. It wasn't arrogance, it was armor. If he acted untouchable, maybe he could still believe it. But inside, the cracks were showing. The city that had once belonged to him now felt hostile. Casino managers turned their backs. Old allies wouldn't take his calls. Even the women who used to orbit around his wealth and danger began to vanish. He was becoming radioactive. Everyone could feel it, the quiet shift before something final. The FBI didn't have to kill him. They just had to watch. They knew the outfit would handle the rest. Chicago had rules about men who brought too much attention. And Tony, for all his loyalty, had broken every one of them. He'd drawn headlines, made enemies, and let emotion cloud judgment. To the bosses, that wasn't just failure. It was treason. By 1985, Spilotro was facing more court cases than he could count. Each one chipped away at the myth. The once untouchable enforcer was now just another mobster on trial. His empire turned to dust. He still carried himself with pride, but even he couldn't hide the exhaustion. He'd tell friends, "They can't keep me down forever." But his eyes said otherwise. The FBI, meanwhile, moved on to bigger fish. They'd used Vegas as their wedge into the outfit's hierarchy. Spilotro had been the key, the symbol of everything they wanted to expose. The arrogance, the violence, the illusion of invincibility. They'd cracked that illusion. What remained was a man waiting for judgment, not from the courts, but from his own people. In the end, it wasn't the FBI's evidence that sealed his fate. It was the silence from Chicago. The calls stopped, the invitations ended, and when his brother Michael suggested they fly back to Illinois to clear things up, Tony didn't argue. Maybe he believed he could talk his way out. Maybe he knew it was already over. The FBI tailed them to the airport, watched them board the plane, and noted it in their reports. Neither man would ever return. The Bureau didn't catch Tony Spilotro alive, but they didn't have to. By the time they were done with him, his legend was broken, his empire gone, his allies either dead or turned. The enforcer who once ruled through silence had been undone by the one thing he couldn't control: attention. And in the end, the city he once owned watched in quiet satisfaction as the lights kept flashing, the chips kept falling, and the game went on without him. Chapter 9. The Skim Scandal. Millions off the top. The money never saw sunlight. It moved quietly, wrapped in cash bundles, counted in dim rooms where walls seemed to hum with secrecy. Every dollar that passed through the casinos of Las Vegas was touched by two hands. The official hand, that of the house, and the other, unseen, the one that reached into the count rooms before anyone noticed what was missing. That second hand belonged to the Chicago outfit. For years, they perfected the system, taking millions off the top of casino profits before the government could tax them, before auditors could count them, before anyone even knew they existed. It was called the skim, and it was Tony Spilotro's job to protect it. The skim wasn't theft, at least not to them. It was tradition, an invisible tax imposed by men who'd built the city in blood and concrete. The casinos might have had legal owners, but everyone in Vegas knew who really ran them. From the Stardust to the Fremont, the outfit had its fingers on every table, every vault, every coin that clinked against the felt. The system ran so smoothly that most dealers and pit bosses never even knew it was happening. That's how good Frank Rosenthal had been at designing it, and that's how good Tony was at keeping it safe. But greed always finds cracks, and in the late 70s, those cracks began to show. In the beginning, the money flowed like water. Couriers carried it out of the casinos in leather bags, through back hallways, out to waiting cars. They'd fly to Kansas City, Milwaukee, or Chicago, where the cash was divided among the bosses. The system depended on silence and discipline, two things that had always kept the mob alive. But silence is expensive, and discipline fades when money piles too high. As Vegas grew, so did the greed. Everyone wanted a bigger cut. The men at the top wanted more. The couriers started skimming their own shares, and the line between loyalty and theft blurred. Tony saw it happening before most. He'd always had an instinct for weakness, the way animals sense fear. He could tell when a man was holding back, when a smile was forced, when someone's loyalty was starting to rot. He tried to control it, to keep order with intimidation. A late payment meant a broken nose. A missing bag meant a man disappeared. For a while it worked. Fear kept the money flowing. But fear can't fix greed. And greed, once it spreads, never stops. The FBI's investigation into the scam began like a whisper. A small team of agents in Kansas City stumbled on cash deposits that didn't match any casino records. At first, it didn't seem like much, just inconsistencies. But those inconsistencies led to conversations, and those conversations led to names. The Bureau started connecting the dots between Teamster loans, casino owners, and Midwest mob families. Every connection pointed back to Vegas. And sitting at the heart of that web was a man whose name had become a legend whispered behind closed doors. Tony Spilotro. The FBI knew they couldn't touch Tony directly. He was too careful, too insulated. They needed to follow the money. So they built their case from the outside in, tracking couriers, intercepting phone calls, and following suitcases full of cash from one state to another. Each suitcase told a story. Each story led to another name. Slowly, the picture came together. The outfit wasn't just skimming millions from Vegas casinos. They were doing it with military precision. It wasn't random theft. It was organized, institutionalized corruption. Meanwhile, inside the casinos, Frank Rosenthal was unraveling. His ban from gaming operations had crippled his authority, and without his control, the skim became sloppy. Tony tried to keep it running, but the two men couldn't stand each other anymore. The tension between them infected everything. The crews, the casinos, even the bosses back in Chicago. Everyone knew it. Vegas had become a circus of egos, and at the center of it all was a fortune that could no longer be hidden. Tony's role was supposed to be simple: protect the skim, make sure no one talked, and handle problems quietly. But his world wasn't quiet anymore. The FBI had ears everywhere, and for the first time, his name started appearing in official reports, not just rumors. They watched him walk into the stardust, shake hands with managers, talk to dealers. Every movement, every glance, every meeting was recorded. The government wasn't just chasing criminals anymore. They were chasing ghosts. The first major break came when agents intercepted a call between Kansas City mobsters discussing casino profits. The voice on the line complained about the Vegas problem, about money coming up short. It was proof that the skim existed. They still didn't have Tony, but they had his world, his machinery, his fingerprints on a city that pretended not to notice him. What followed was one of the most extensive investigations in FBI history, a coordinated effort stretching from the Midwest to the desert. Operation Strawman, they called it. The name didn't mean much at first, but in the end, it would dismantle the illusion of mob control in Las Vegas forever. Tony could feel the noose tightening. Agents followed him everywhere: restaurants, meetings, even church. He could spot them easily now. The same faces, the same unmarked cars, the same eyes watching from behind newspapers. He didn't hide. He smiled, sometimes waved. But behind the smile, he was angry. Not afraid, not yet, angry. He'd built this empire for the outfit, kept it alive through blood and fear, and now they were treating him like the problem. Chicago had started asking questions, too. The bosses wanted to know why the FBI was suddenly all over Vegas. They wanted to know why the money had slowed down. Tony blamed Frank. Frank blamed Tony. Both men were right. The system was collapsing because both had lost control. Rosenthal's obsession with legitimacy and Tony's addiction to power had drawn too much light. The casinos weren't shadows anymore. They were under microscopes. And in that kind of light, even ghosts can't hide. The final blow came in the form of paper. The FBI finally connected the dots between Teamster loans, mob-owned front companies, and the casinos. Subpoenas went out. Grand juries convened. Indictments followed like dominoes falling. The bosses in Chicago, Milwaukee, and Kansas City were furious. The scheme that had made them millionaires was now evidence. The word tax evasion was whispered alongside racketeering. The golden years of Vegas were over. Tony tried to act unbothered. He'd been under pressure before, and he'd always survived. But this was different. The danger wasn't just from the feds, it was from his own family. The outfit didn't forgive mistakes. And in their eyes, Tony's failure to keep Vegas clean was more than a mistake. It was betrayal. He'd let emotion cloud business. He'd drawn attention to something that was supposed to stay invisible. To them, that made him a liability. The FBI raids came like thunder. Agents stormed casinos, seized records, hauled away boxes of ledgers and cash. The papers ran front-page photos of men in suits being led away in handcuffs. The illusion was shattered. The city built on silence was now loud with scandal. Tourists didn't care. The slot machines kept ringing. The showgirls kept dancing. But behind the scenes, everything had changed. The mob's grip had finally loosened. For Tony, the fallout was devastating. His crew was scattered, his allies either dead or in hiding. Chicago cut off contact. No calls, no orders, just silence. And silence in that world meant one thing. You were finished. He'd gone from feared enforcer to expendable asset. Even his own brother Michael could see it. He tried to reason with Tony, to get him out of Vegas, to walk away before it was too late. But Tony wouldn't hear it. They need me, he said. They'll always need me. He believed it, because the alternative was too terrifying to face. But the truth was written on every headline. The skim scandal had ripped away the last layer of protection around him. The FBI might not have caught him yet, but they didn't need to. They'd already done what no one else could. Made him vulnerable. The outfit didn't tolerate vulnerability. The irony was that Tony had always believed money was safety. But in the end, it was money that destroyed him. Every dollar skimmed off the top was another breadcrumb leading back to him. The feds didn't need confessions or witnesses anymore. They had the math. The flow of cash from Vegas to Chicago was a straight line of greed, and Tony's fingerprints were everywhere along it. He tried to keep up appearances, attending court hearings in fine suits, flashing that calm, polite smile. Reporters followed him from courthouse steps to parking lots, shouting questions about the mob, about the skim, about Frank Rosenthal. He'd stop sometimes, light a cigarette, and say something charming like, "Gentlemen, I'm just a businessman." The cameras loved him. The irony burned. He'd once ruled Vegas from the shadows, and now he was a celebrity criminal. Behind the scenes, the tension in Chicago reached a breaking point. Joe Pesci, Tony's old mentor, was facing his own indictments, and the bosses were looking for someone to blame. Spilotro's name came up again and again. He brought too much heat, too much chaos. The skim was gone, the feds were everywhere, and Vegas, the outfit's crown jewel, was ruined. They couldn't fix it, but they could make an example. Tony felt it coming. You could always feel it before it happened. The change in tone, the sudden quiet, the way old friends stopped calling. He'd seen it before, 100 times, in Chicago basements and desert holes. But he told himself it would be different for him. He'd done too much, given too much. They wouldn't turn on him. They couldn't. That was the lie he carried, the one that kept him walking when everyone else had already stepped back. By the time the skim trials began, Tony was an outsider in his own world. The bosses didn't invite him to meetings. His men didn't trust him. The feds were still following, still waiting. And the city he once ruled now treated him like a ghost of its past, a relic of the old Vegas that corporations were quickly replacing with boardrooms and shareholders. The neon still glowed, but it belonged to someone else now. In the quiet hours before dawn, Tony would sit on his back porch, the desert stretching endlessly in front of him. He'd think about Chicago, about the streets where he learned to fight, about the restaurant his father ran, about how simple things had been before the money, before Vegas. But there was no going back. The skim had made him rich, powerful, feared, and it had also written his death sentence. The FBI had done its job. They hadn't arrested Tony Spilotro for the skim. They didn't need to. They'd exposed the machine, and once it was exposed, it turned on itself. Vegas had no room for ghosts anymore. The city would move on, rebuild, forget. But for Tony, there would be no rebuilding. His world was collapsing, one quiet betrayal at a time. The man who once made others disappear was now the one everyone wished would vanish. He flicked his cigarette into the desert sand and watched it glow. In the distance, the lights of the strip still shimmered, as if mocking him. It all looked the same, but everything had changed. The money was gone. The loyalty was gone. The silence, the thing he'd built his entire life around, was louder than ever. And somewhere far away, in a Chicago basement or backroom, someone was already saying the words he'd always known were coming. It's time to take care of Tony. Chapter 10. The Fall of Frank Rosenthal. Explosion on East Sahara. The night was quiet, the kind of Vegas night when the city hums softly under its own neon heartbeat. It was October 4th, 1982. Frank Rosenthal, the man who had once ruled the casinos with mathematical precision and ice-cold confidence, walked out of Tony Roma's restaurant on East Sahara Avenue, unaware that every step he took was toward the moment his entire life would catch fire. The air was cool, still almost rehearsed. He slid into his Cadillac Eldorado, shut the door, and turned the key. What followed was a roar that split the desert silence, a fireball tearing through metal and glass, the shockwave echoing across the empty parking lot. For a second, it looked like the end of Frank "Lefty" Rosenthal. But like every gambler who knew how to survive his own odds, he walked away from the explosion alive. Barely. The bombing didn't kill him, but it killed everything else: his career, his power, his fragile alliance with the outfit, and whatever remained of his relationship with Tony Spilotro. It was more than an assassination attempt. It was the final act in a story that had burned too long, too bright, and too recklessly. Vegas had been built on illusion, but that night, the illusion ended in flames. In the months leading up to the explosion, Frank had been a man under siege. His world was unraveling piece by piece, his casinos stripped from him by state regulators, his marriage destroyed by betrayal, his protection from Chicago fading into silence. He'd gone from being the golden brain of the outfit to an inconvenient liability. The same men who once toasted his success were now whispering about him behind closed doors. He'd made enemies everywhere: bureaucrats, gangsters, gamblers, even the FBI. And through it all, one name hung in the air like a curse: Tony Spilotro. Their partnership had turned into a Cold War. Once they'd been the perfect pair, Frank the brain, Tony the muscle. But somewhere between the skim and the scandals, respect curdled into hatred. Frank saw Tony as a thug who ruined his empire with greed and violence. Tony saw Frank as an arrogant coward who thought brains could replace fear. They'd survived together as long as they had because they needed each other. Now, they were surviving in spite of each other. In the weeks before the explosion, Frank grew paranoid. He'd been warned to watch his back. He stopped taking the same routes home, checked under his car every morning, avoided phone calls. He wasn't wrong to worry. The outfit had already turned against him. The FBI was circling, and Tony was losing control of Vegas. Everyone knew it was only a matter of time before something snapped. That night at Tony Roma's, Frank ate alone. Witnesses remembered him sitting quietly, sipping coffee, barely touching his food. He looked exhausted, haunted even. When he left, he nodded to the hostess, walked out to the parking lot, and stepped into his car. He didn't notice the small device wired under the driver's seat. When the key turned, the bomb detonated, blowing the hood into the air, tearing the doors from their hinges, and sending a plume of fire into the night sky. Somehow, by sheer luck or divine irony, Frank survived. The blast had been mounted on the wrong side of the car. The explosion hurled him out through the door, burned and dazed but alive. He stumbled into the parking lot as bystanders screamed and sirens wailed in the distance. When investigators arrived, they found fragments of dynamite twisted metal, and the unmistakable mark of a professional hit. Everyone knew what it meant. This wasn't random. This was mob justice. The message was simple. Frank Rosenthal's luck had finally run out. But to their surprise, it hadn't. The man who had survived every scheme, every betrayal, every federal investigation had somehow survived his own murder. The police questioned him at the hospital. He refused to cooperate. "Accidents happen," he said with a faint smirk, his voice still hoarse from the smoke. He knew the rules. You didn't name names, not even when everyone already knew them. But behind the silence, his suspicions were already forming. And every suspicion pointed to one man. Tony Spilotro didn't visit the hospital. He didn't send flowers. He didn't even call. To outsiders, that might have looked like indifference, but to those who knew the mob, it meant something else: distance. Tony had learned long ago that proximity to a dead man, or one who should have been dead, could get you killed too. Whether he ordered the hit or not, the moment that car exploded, their partnership was over. Frank never forgave him. For the rest of his life, he would insist, quietly, but with certainty, that Tony was behind it. Whether he was right or not remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of Vegas. Some said Chicago ordered it. Others believed it was a rogue act by men loyal to Tony, a message that went too far. A few even suggested it was a warning, not an execution, a way of scaring Frank into silence. Whatever the truth, it didn't matter. The outcome was the same. Vegas was done with him. The explosion became a symbol of the city's unraveling. Newspapers splashed it across front pages. TV crews swarmed the site, and the FBI moved in faster than ever. The myth of invincible mob control was dying in public view. The stardust, once the crown jewel of the outfit's empire, became radioactive. Executives resigned, investors panicked, and regulators smelled blood. The skim, the secret, the shadow that had fed the mob for years, it was all out in the open now. For Tony, the bombing was both a relief and a curse. With Frank gone, he no longer had to share power. Vegas was his again, at least on the surface, but it also made him the face of the chaos. The FBI saw him as the man pulling every string. Chicago saw him as the man who had lost control of the operation. And Vegas saw him as the villain in a story that had gone from glamour to tragedy. He'd wanted power, and now he had it. Alone, surrounded by ghosts. The investigation into the explosion dragged on, but no one was ever charged. Frank moved out of Vegas soon after, first to California, then to Florida, living in quiet exile. He became a ghost of his former self, still sharp, still proud, but haunted by the city that had nearly killed him. He'd tell anyone who would listen that he'd been betrayed, that Vegas had turned into a circus run by fools and killers. His words carried bitterness, but also truth. The Vegas he'd built, the one run on discipline, respect, and precision, was gone. In its place stood a wild, paranoid version of the same dream, ruled by men who thought fear was enough to keep it alive. Tony didn't see it that way. To him, Vegas was still his kingdom. He'd survived too long, outsmarted too many, to believe he could be touched. But the bombing changed something inside him. The paranoia that had once been useful now consumed him. He began seeing threats everywhere. In his crew, in Chicago, even in his own family. Every friend became a potential enemy, every shadow a warning. He stopped trusting people, stopped sleeping, stopped smiling. He was unraveling, just like Frank had. The FBI used the chaos to tighten their grip. They leaned harder on informants, especially Frank Collada. His testimony became the spine of their case against Tony. He told them everything: how the crew operated, who Tony met, what he ordered, what he feared. He painted a picture of a man who had gone from feared enforcer to reckless tyrant. The FBI didn't even need to prove Tony's guilt anymore. They just needed to wait. They knew the outfit would take care of it themselves. In Chicago, the bosses were running out of patience. The Vegas operation, once their most profitable venture, had become a public disaster. The FBI raids, the media circus, the failed bombing, all of it traced back to Tony. He'd brought too much heat, too much attention. To them, he was no longer an asset. He was a liability. And in their world, liabilities were buried. Frank Rosenthal, meanwhile, kept talking. He gave interviews, wrote letters, appeared in documentaries. He became a reluctant symbol of survival, the man who'd walked away from death. But every time he spoke, his bitterness slipped through. Vegas isn't what it used to be, he'd say. It's all smoke now. The real players are gone. He never mentioned Tony by name in public, but he didn't have to. The silence between them spoke louder than words. The explosion on East Sahara was more than an assassination attempt. It was a turning point. It marked the end of an era when men like Rosenthal and Spilotro could operate in the open. The old Vegas, built on handshake deals and quiet threats, was gone. Corporations were taking over, laws were tightening, and the mob's empire was collapsing from the inside. The same men who'd built it were now running for their lives or digging their own graves. Tony still walked the strip, but the respect was gone. Dealers no longer looked away when he passed. Pit bosses didn't whisper his name in fear. He was a relic of a dying age, clinging to power in a city that had moved on. The once untouchable enforcer now looked over his shoulder everywhere he went. He could feel the eyes on him, not the FBI's this time, but his own people's. Chicago's silence was louder than sirens. He'd always believed silence meant power. Now he knew it meant death. Frank left Vegas alive, but Tony stayed. He couldn't leave. The city was part of him now. The lights, the noise, the smell of money and sweat and cigarette smoke. It was the only place he'd ever truly ruled. But power in Vegas had always come with an expiration date. His had arrived. He just didn't know it yet. The explosion that should have killed Frank Rosenthal didn't just destroy a car. It destroyed everything the outfit had built in Las Vegas. It exposed the cracks, the betrayals, the greed, the arrogance. And in those cracks, Tony Spilotro's empire began to crumble, one piece at a time. He'd outlived Frank's car bomb, but he wouldn't outlive what came next. The desert was patient, and so were the men in Chicago. They were watching, waiting, calculating the moment when the last loose end of the Vegas empire would finally disappear beneath the sand. The man who had enforced silence his whole life was now surrounded by it. Every ally gone, every favor repaid, every warning ignored. The explosion hadn't killed him, but it had started to count down. And in Vegas, when the countdown hits zero, there's only one sound left to hear. The sound of the desert swallowing another king. Chapter 11. The Hole in the Wall Bust. End of the Crew. It was July 4th, 1981. The night of fireworks, celebration, and flashing lights that painted Las Vegas in red, white, and gold. But while the Strip erupted with cheers and champagne, somewhere on the west side of the city, in the dark silence behind a small furniture store called Bertha's Gifts and Home Furnishings, another kind of show was about to begin. The men in black masks weren't here for the fireworks. They were here for diamonds, cash, and a promise made to their boss, Anthony Spilotro. It was supposed to be quick, clean, and invisible. Just another job. But instead, it would become the night that destroyed everything Tony had built. The Hole in the Wall gang, the once untouchable crew that had ruled Las Vegas's underbelly, would crumble in a single, echoing moment of failure. The plan was simple, or at least it seemed that way. Break in through the adjoining wall, bypass the alarms, hit the safes, and vanish before sunrise. It was a formula that had worked for years. Tony's men were professionals, burglars so skilled they could rob a vault and leave before the police even knew what had happened. They had done it dozens of times. Hotels, jewelry stores, high-end homes. But this job was different. This job was cursed before it even began. Tony wasn't there that night. He rarely was anymore. He had grown too visible, too watched. Instead, he left the details to his crew, to men he trusted, men like Frank Collada. They were his eyes, his hands, his ghosts. But ghosts can only hide for so long. The crew met in the desert hours before the job, their cars parked in a half-circle under the endless Nevada sky. They loaded tools, drills, torches, sledgehammers, into the trunks, checking their gear one last time. Collada handed out walkie-talkies, glancing toward the horizon. In and out clean, he said. No noise, no heat. They nodded, confident, even cocky. After all, they were the best at what they did. The Hole-in-the-Wall gang wasn't just a nickname. It was their trademark, their art form. They didn't break locks, they broke walls. Quiet, precise, unstoppable. Tonight would be no different. Or so they thought. Inside Bertha's, alarms had already been updated. New models, newly installed just days before. No one in the crew knew. No one could have known. As they cut through the wall, the drills whined, sending dust into the air, and every turn of the bit sealed their fate. The alarms didn't scream immediately. They were silent alarms, the kind that whispered instead of shouted. Within minutes, the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department had been notified. Units moved quietly through the dark streets, surrounding the building as the crew worked, unaware. They were inside now, bags filling with jewelry, cash drawers emptied, the adrenaline making their hands steady. The silence, they thought, was their luck. But outside, red and blue lights crept closer. When the first cop shouted, "Freeze!" the illusion shattered. The robbers turned, eyes wide, caught mid-motion. It was chaos, shouts, sirens, flashlights cutting through the dark. Collada froze, his mind racing. They'd been set up. Someone had tipped off the cops. Within minutes, they were in handcuffs, lined against the wall of the very building they'd been trying to rob. The night that was supposed to mark another victory became the night the crew ended. Word of the bust hit the headlines by morning. Hole-in-the-Wall gang caught in major Vegas heist. For law enforcement, it was a triumph. For Tony Spilotro, it was a disaster. The paper didn't just expose the crew, it exposed him. The arrest tied directly back to him, not by name at first, but by implication. Everyone in Vegas knew who the Hole-in-the-Wall gang worked for. And the FBI, already circling him like vultures, finally had something real. When Tony heard the news, he didn't shout or curse. He just sat there, quiet, smoking, staring at nothing. He'd built the crew as an extension of himself, a way to control the streets while he protected the outfit's interests. But somewhere along the line, the crew stopped being the outfit's and started being his. That was the problem. The bosses back in Chicago had warned him. They didn't want extra attention. They wanted quiet money, clean profits, invisible control. But Tony couldn't stay invisible anymore. His name had become synonymous with violence and spectacle. The bust wasn't just an embarrassment. It was proof that he'd lost control. The men sat in jail, furious and frightened. They knew the rules. When you worked for the mob, you kept your mouth shut. You did your time. You didn't talk. But fear has a way of rewriting loyalty, and this time, the fear wasn't just of prison. It was of Tony himself. Everyone knew what happened to men who disappointed him. But Collada, sitting in his cell, staring at the cold concrete wall, began to think differently. He'd followed Tony since Chicago, through everything. He'd seen him kill, threaten, survive. But lately, Tony wasn't the same. He was paranoid, reckless, unpredictable. Collada started to wonder if the man he once trusted would protect him, or have him silenced. That doubt grew every day. The FBI could sense it. They visited Collada, offered him a deal. "You give us Spilotro," they said, "and we'll give you your life." He didn't answer right away, but he didn't refuse either. They came back the next day, and the next, wearing him down, promising protection, safety, freedom. And slowly, the idea began to make sense. He'd seen too many friends end up in the desert. Maybe it was time to save himself. Tony, meanwhile, tried to manage the damage. He called in favors, sent lawyers, tried to keep his name out of the papers. But the writing was on the wall. The outfit was furious. IAPA wanted answers. "You said you'd keep Vegas clean," he told Tony through intermediaries. "Now we've got federal heat, headlines, and rats." Tony promised to fix it, but his words didn't mean much anymore. Chicago didn't trust him, the FBI was closing in, and his crew, his last real link to power, was sitting in jail, ready to break. When Collada finally flipped, the betrayal cut deeper than any bullet ever could. He met with the FBI, confessed everything, Every robbery, every threat, every murder Tony had ordered or committed. He told them about Chicago, about Vegas, about the Skim, about the hole-in-the-wall gang. It was a confession years in the making, and it cracked the foundation of Tony's empire wide open. The FBI had their witness, their insider, their smoking gun. The man who once enforced silence with violence was now being destroyed by words. Tony tried to act like it didn't matter. He told people Collado was lying, that the feds had broken him, that it was all a setup. But deep down, he knew it was true. Frank had seen too much, and once the feds had him, there was no going back. The trials that followed turned Tony from a shadow into a headline. His face was everywhere: magazines, newspapers, TV screens. The man who once ruled from the dark corners of Vegas was now a public spectacle. Reporters followed him from courthouse to courthouse, asking if he feared for his life. He'd smile faintly, light a cigarette, and say, "I don't fear much." But that was a lie. The hole-in-the-wall case became a disaster in every sense. The state had witnesses, the feds had tapes, and Chicago had lost its patience. Tony's grip on Vegas, once absolute, was gone. The casinos he used to walk through freely now barred him from entry. The dealers he used to avert their eyes now whispered behind his back. The bosses who used to trust him now saw him as the man who had brought the entire house of cards down. The FBI used the case to tear apart what was left of organized crime's hold on Las Vegas. With Collada's testimony, they exposed networks that had been untouchable for decades. Indictments spread from Nevada to Illinois, hitting men who'd thought themselves immune. For the government, it was a victory. For Tony, it was humiliation. Every headline was another wound. Every new trial another nail in the coffin. The man who'd once terrified a city now looked like a relic, a symbol of a dying age. But even as his empire crumbled, Tony refused to run. He told himself he could fix it, that he could outlast the storm. That was his fatal flaw. He'd built his life on the belief that he could control everything. But now, the world around him was chaos. Chicago was shifting to new leadership, younger, colder men who didn't remember the loyalty he'd once earned. To them, he was a problem to be erased. Vegas was no longer the mob's playground. It was a liability, and Tony was the loudest reminder of everything they'd lost. He spent his final years in courtrooms and shadows, fighting cases he couldn't win, chasing respect that no longer existed. The hole-in-the-wall bust had stripped him of his fearsome aura. To the FBI, he was a case study. To the outfit, he was a mistake. And to himself, he was still the kid from the patch who thought he could beat the odds. But this time, the odds weren't in his favor. On quiet nights, when the noise of Vegas faded and the wind swept across the desert, Tony would sit in his car outside the stardust, watching the lights flicker across the sky. He'd think about the men he'd lost, the ones he'd buried, the ones who betrayed him, the ones who still haunted him. He'd think about Jerry, about Frank, about the fire that had once burned so bright it blinded them all. He'd wonder if this was how it was always supposed to end, not with a gunshot or a confession, but with silence. The hole-in-the-wall bust wasn't just the end of his crew, it was the end of his legend. The enforcer who had built Vegas on fear was now a man trapped by his own myth. And somewhere in Chicago, the men who had once called him Tony the Ant were already planning his final chapter. They didn't need the FBI to take him down. They would do it the old way. Quiet, precise, final. The fireworks that lit up Vegas that night in 1981 had long faded, but the echoes of that failed heist never did. Every crack in the wall, every silent alarm, every siren had been part of something bigger, an explosion that would ripple all the way back to Chicago. Tony thought he'd built an empire strong enough to outlive him. He was wrong. It had collapsed in a single night, with a single mistake, and there was no rebuilding it now. In the desert, time moves differently. Empires rise, burn, and vanish beneath the sand. For Tony Spilotro, the man who thought he could rule both fear and fate, that lesson was coming fast. The hole-in-the-wall gang was gone, the money was gone, and the trust was gone. All that remained was a man waiting for a call he already knew would come. He just didn't know when. or how far into the desert they'd take him before the silence came for him. 2. Chapter 12. Trials, Informants, and the Heat from Chicago. The courtroom smelled of dust and cheap cologne, the kind of stale air that clings to tension and whispers. The ceiling fans turned lazily above, and every time the door creaked open, all eyes flicked toward it. On that day, sitting at the defense table in a tailored suit that fit him too well for a man accused of crimes he claimed he didn't commit, was Anthony Spilotro. He wasn't shackled. He wasn't slouched. He looked composed, expressionless, as if the courtroom were just another backroom meeting. To his left, lawyers shuffled papers, whispered strategies, and to his right, the FBI agents who had chased him for nearly a decade watched him like hunters who'd finally cornered their prey. This was where the myth would be stripped down to a man. The enforcer of Las Vegas, the ghost of Chicago, was now just a defendant in the bright, sterile light of justice. It began with the testimonies. The witnesses were nervous, voices cracking under the weight of years spent pretending they didn't know the man sitting before them. But none shook the room the way Frank Collada did. When he took the stand, it was as if the air itself recoiled. Tony didn't look up at first. He didn't need to. He already knew the voice too well. It was the voice that used to whisper plans over dinner, the one that laughed beside him after a job, the one that once swore loyalty without hesitation. Now it was the voice that might end him. Collada sat there, calm but uneasy, eyes scanning the room like a man who knew every corner could hide a ghost from his past. The prosecutors asked questions, and he answered each one with precision, like a man cutting open a wound he'd been forced to keep hidden. He told them everything. How Tony ran his crew, how he ordered robberies and murders, how he turned Las Vegas into his own criminal laboratory. He talked about the hole-in-the-wall gang, about the hidden cash, the silent threats, the way Tony controlled men with fear so deep it became habit. The jury hung on every word. The reporters scribbled like mad. And Tony? He finally looked up. Not with rage, not with shock, just a small, tired smile that didn't reach his eyes. He knew what this was. It wasn't betrayal. It was inevitability. The FBI had waited years for this moment. They'd built entire careers around the idea of breaking him. They had watched him evade charge after charge, outlast raids, intimidate witnesses, and charm judges. But now, sitting in a room where silence meant nothing and words meant death, they finally had what they wanted, a man on the inside. Pointing his finger at the Aunt Collada's words painted a picture of a man both feared and doomed, the kind of man who lived too long in the shadows to ever step back into the light. The prosecutors laid out everything, the robberies, the extortions, the skim, even the whispers of murder. They brought in evidence, photographs, recordings, bank ledgers, testimonies. The walls of the courtroom felt like a museum of Tony's sins. Each new exhibit chipped away at the myth. To the FBI, this wasn't just about putting away one man. It was about closing a chapter of American organized crime. If they could convict Tony Spilotro, they could finally prove that no one was untouchable. But Tony was no ordinary defendant. He was patient, unflinching, a man who had long learned that fear was useless unless you could control it. He would sit there, legs crossed, hands folded neatly on the table, eyes moving only when necessary. When the prosecutor said his name, he'd tilt his head slightly, as if listening to music only he could hear. The jury noticed. They couldn't decide if they were watching a criminal or a man who simply refused to break. In the back of the courtroom, agents whispered that he was playing a role again, the cool-headed enforcer, the ghost in a suit. But beneath the surface, he was suffocating. The headlines were relentless. Every newspaper in the country plastered his name, calling him the real-life Joe Pesci, the Vegas Ant, the man who brought Chicago to the desert. He'd become a caricature of himself, a legend being torn down in slow motion. Outside the courtroom, Vegas had moved on. The new casinos were corporate now, the mob's fingerprints scrubbed from the walls. Men in tailored suits ran the tables, not soldiers in silk shirts. The FBI had declared victory. The city had turned the page. But Tony couldn't. He didn't know how. Vegas had been his empire, his masterpiece. Watching it slip away, while the world cheered, felt like watching his own funeral play out in real time. The trials dragged on, one after another. Racketeering, conspiracy, tax evasion. Each time, he beat the odds, either through lack of evidence or the fear that still clung to his name. He walked out of courtrooms with that same half-smile, shaking hands with his lawyers, lighting cigarettes for the cameras. But every victory was smaller than the one before. The outfit wasn't celebrating his escapes anymore. They saw them as accidents, not triumphs. And accidents ran out eventually. Chicago's bosses were growing restless. The FBI pressure wasn't just on Tony, it was on them. The investigations into the skim, the Teamsters loans, and the Vegas connections had put everyone under scrutiny. They needed a way to cut the chain of evidence. They needed to remove the source of the noise. To them, Vegas wasn't a gold mine anymore. It was a liability. And Tony Spilotro had become its symbol. The word from above was quiet, but final. Clean up the mess. Tony sensed it. He'd been in the life too long not to. He could tell by the tone of the calls that still came from back home. The ones that used to end with "we're proud of you," now ended with "keep your head down." He could tell by the way his Chicago contacts stopped visiting, by how his lawyers spoke in shorter sentences, by how his brother Michael looked at him like he was already gone. The world around him was turning colder, shrinking, closing in. The betrayal from Collada had already broken something in him, something deeper than anger. Loyalty had been his religion, and seeing it evaporate under fluorescent lights made him question everything he'd ever believed about the code. He'd spent his life enforcing silence, only to watch words destroy him. But the irony wasn't lost on him. He'd built his empire with fear. Now fear was dismantling it. He still carried himself like the boss of the desert, but the illusion was fading fast. The younger guys didn't fear him the way they used to. They'd grown up hearing stories about the ant, but stories lose their power when the man they're about is sitting in courtrooms instead of counting cash. Even his enemies in law enforcement felt something strange, almost pity. They'd spent years chasing the ghost of a legend, and now that they had him, he was just another man growing old under the weight of his own mistakes. Tony's lawyers tried to spin a narrative of misunderstanding. "My client is a businessman," they told the jury, "a man caught in a web of false accusations." The argument might have worked in the old days, when money could buy silence and intimidation could buy forgetfulness. But this was the 80s. The country wanted heroes and villains, and the mob was the perfect monster for the story America wanted to tell itself. Tony wasn't a businessman anymore. He was the villain on every front page, the face of an era everyone wanted to pretend was over. When the verdicts came, they were mixed, some acquittals, some hung juries, a few convictions on smaller charges. Enough to weaken him, but not enough to cage him. The law hadn't killed him, but Chicago's patience had. By now, the outfit's top brass, men like Joe Pesci and John Cerrone, were themselves under federal indictment, thanks in part to the Vegas investigations. They saw Tony not as a brother in arms, but as the reason for the chaos. His name had become a beacon for the FBI. Every agent in every city wanted a piece of him, and the more famous he got, the more dangerous he became to the men still trying to stay invisible. Back in Vegas, Tony tried to act as though nothing had changed. He still showed up at restaurants, still smiled for the cameras, still sat at his favorite table at the Green Valley restaurant, eating the same meals, wearing the same gold watch. But behind the charm, he was unraveling. He was angry all the time, pacing at night, snapping at his brother Michael, arguing with anyone who questioned him. The confidence that once made him magnetic now felt like desperation. He was fighting a war that had already been lost. Michael worried constantly. He wasn't like Tony. He didn't crave the power or the fear. He just wanted peace, to keep his brother safe, to stop the spiral. But even he could see what was coming. The outfit silence had turned into absence. The calls from Chicago had stopped completely. And when silence replaced conversation in their world, it never meant safety. It meant the clock was ticking. Tony tried to convince himself otherwise. He'd built a life, out of believing he could control fate, that he could charm death as easily as he charmed danger. But fate had a way of catching up to men like him. The FBI could arrest him. The press could destroy his reputation. But only the outfit could decide when his story ended. The trials were over, but the punishment hadn't come yet. It wouldn't come from the courts or the government. It would come from men he'd once called family, men who'd shared meals with him, men who had watched him rise. Chicago had decided that the noise needed to stop, and the only way to stop it was to make the source disappear. Tony didn't know when it would happen. No one ever did. Maybe that was the cruelest part, the waiting. Every time the phone rang, every time a car slowed near his house, every time someone said, "They want to see you back home," a chill ran through him that he tried to hide. He'd smile, nod, pretend he wasn't afraid. But deep down he knew. He'd seen too many endings to mistake what this was. The outfit had a simple rule. When a man becomes bigger than the family buries him. He spent his last few months walking through Vegas like a ghost, retracing the places that had once been his kingdom. The jewelry store, the casinos, the restaurants, all still standing, all alive, but none of them is anymore. The city had moved on, but he couldn't. The neon still flickered the same, but it didn't belong to him. The streets still whispered his name, but now it was in past tense. He told his brother Michael that everything would be fine, that the bosses just wanted to talk, that things could still be smoothed out. He didn't believe it. But Michael, loyal and loving, followed him anyway. They'd built their lives on loyalty, and they'd die by it too. The trials, the informants, the betrayals, none of it had broken him completely. What would break him was the silence from Chicago. That was the kind of silence he couldn't fight, the kind that came for everyone eventually. Tony Spilotro, the man who ruled Vegas with quiet rage, had finally reached the one silence he couldn't control. And somewhere, far from the lights, a phone rang in a Chicago backroom, and a voice said softly, "Bring him in." Chapter 13. Brothers in Blood, Tony and Michael Spilotro. They used to say the Spilotro brothers were inseparable, even when they shouldn't have been. Tony was the storm, unpredictable, electric, violent. Michael was the calm, the quiet shadow that tried to soften what Tony's rage couldn't. Together, they were more than brothers. They were an empire in miniature, bound not just by blood, but by a kind of loyalty that felt ancient, tribal, almost sacred. In Chicago, that kind of loyalty could make you or kill you. For Tony and Michael Spilotro, it would do both. Michael had always been different. Where Tony saw the world in terms of power and fear, Michael saw it through the lens of family and survival. He wasn't a gangster by nature. He didn't have the taste for blood or the need for dominance that defined his brother. He was clean-cut, soft-spoken, even kind in a way that made people underestimate him. He opened a restaurant in Vegas called the Gold Rush, and for a while, it looked like he might actually stay on the straight path. But no one related to Tony Spilotro stayed clean for long. The shadow of his brother stretched too far, too deep. When Tony came to Vegas to oversee the outfit's interests, Michael followed. At first, it seemed harmless. Family looking out for family. Tony trusted no one else more, and Michael idolized him in the way younger brothers often do. The belief that loyalty could protect you from the world. But Vegas wasn't a city for family bonds. It was a city that fed on weakness, that turned love into liability. The moment Michael stepped into Tony's orbit, his fate was sealed. They worked together quietly at first. Michael handled the fronts, the restaurants, the shops, the legitimate businesses that gave the illusion of respectability. Tony handled the rest. Michael wasn't a part of the violence, not directly, but he was close enough to see it. He'd sit in the corner of Tony's store as his brother talked with men whose eyes were dead long before their hearts stopped beating. He heard things he wished he hadn't, and little by little, he stopped asking questions. That's how it worked. You didn't have to be in the life to be swallowed by it. You just had to stand too close to someone who was. For years, Michael believed Tony could protect him. No matter what happened, feds, rival crews, angry bosses, Tony always landed on his feet. He was untouchable, the man everyone feared but no one dared move against. If Tony said everything would be fine, then it had to be. Michael wanted to believe that. He needed to. But by the mid-'80s, even Tony couldn't lie to himself anymore. The outfit was turning cold on them. Chicago had stopped returning calls, and the feds had made their lives a slow, public suffocation. Michael saw the change in his brother before anyone else. The arrogance that once made Tony magnetic had hardened into something bitter, something desperate. He'd pace late into the night, smoking, muttering to himself about people who'd forgotten who made them. Sometimes he'd stare out at the lights of Vegas, his reflection faint in the glass, and say, "They think they can erase me." Michael would try to calm him down, tell him to let it go, to walk away, to move back to Chicago and start over. But Tony couldn't walk away. He didn't know how. Power was his addiction, and Vegas had been his longest high. The brothers grew closer as the walls closed in. Tony had lost almost everyone he'd trusted. Colada had flipped, the outfit was silent, and his crew was scattered. Michael became the only person left who still believed in him. They'd eat together, drive through the desert just to get away from the noise, talk about childhood, about their parents, about how far they'd come. Sometimes Tony would laugh, real laughter, the kind that sounded like the kid from the Patch Again. But then it would fade, and he'd go quiet, staring into the sand like he could already see his grave there. When Chicago called, Tony pretended it was good news. He told Michael the bosses wanted to clear things up, that all the heat would blow over, that they just wanted to talk. Michael didn't trust it. He'd heard too many stories about men being invited back home, only to vanish. But Tony couldn't believe they'd betray him. "They wouldn't touch me," he said. "Not after everything I've done for them." Michael didn't argue. He just nodded. Because what could he say? His brother had built his whole life on that illusion. In June 1986, the call came that would end everything. Chicago wanted a meeting. Tony told Michael they'd fly out together, take care of it, come back in a few days. Michael hesitated, but Tony insisted. "You're coming with me," he said. "If they see we're solid, they'll know we're still family." It was the last lie he ever told. Before they left, Michael called his wife. He told her not to worry, that he'd be home soon. There was a tremor in his voice he couldn't hide. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was prophecy. Tony didn't make any calls. He just packed his suit, kissed his wife, and said he'd be back before the weekend. They drove to the airport in silence, the desert sun burning low on the horizon. Two brothers, one world between them, both pretending this wasn't the end. The flight to Chicago was uneventful. The landing was smooth. They rented a car, drove toward the suburbs. Tony had a list of addresses in his pocket, all of them meaningless. The real destination wasn't written anywhere. They were told to meet some of the outfit guys in Bensonville, a quiet neighborhood far from downtown. Tony said it was just a sit down, that they'd clear the air and be home by dinner. Michael stayed silent, hands gripping the steering wheel too tight. They pulled up to a modest house on a quiet street. No one knew what was said inside. What's known came later, in whispers, in confessions, in reports buried deep in case files. The story goes that Tony and Michael were led down to the basement. There were familiar faces there, men they'd known for years, men who'd eaten at their table, laughed at their jokes. Tony must have known the moment he saw them. Maybe it was the way they avoided his eyes. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was just the instinct that had kept him alive this long. But there was no escape now. What happened next has been retold 1,000 ways, but they all end the same. The brothers were beaten, strangled, and buried in a cornfield near Enos, Indiana. No gunfire, no spectacle, just the quiet efficiency of the world they'd served. The same world that had raised them now swallowed them whole. When their bodies were found days later, the news hit like a thunderclap. The Spilotro brothers, once symbols of fear and power, were gone, reduced to a cautionary tale. Back in Vegas, people whispered their names with a strange mix of fear and pity. Some said they got what they deserved. Others said it was the saddest ending imaginable, that Tony had dragged his brother into a death he didn't earn. Michael's family wept in private. Tony's wife said nothing. The outfit said even less. In their silence, the message was clear. Business had been handled. The FBI, for all their efforts, hadn't won the way they wanted. They hadn't put Tony behind bars or watched him break on the witness stand. But they'd watched something better, in their eyes, the system eat its own. They'd seen a man who once defied the law, undone not by justice, but by the very code he'd enforced. The enforcer had been enforced. The silence he'd demanded all his life had finally claimed him. For years after, Chicago remained quiet on the subject. No one spoke Tony's name in meetings. His story became a ghost story, a warning told to young associates about what happens when you forget where the power truly lies. In that world, loyalty was currency, but it could only be spent once. Tony had spent his. Michael's death was the part that haunted people the most. He wasn't supposed to die that way. He'd never been one of them, not really. He just followed his brother, believing that blood meant safety. But in the outfit, blood only ever meant ownership. When they buried Tony, they buried the last man who still believed the mob could be tamed by loyalty. And when they buried Michael, they buried whatever innocence the Spilotro name had left. In Vegas, the world moved on fast. The casinos kept glowing, the money kept flowing, and the ghosts faded into the desert heat. The new bosses didn't carry guns. They carried contracts. The city didn't bleed anymore. It just consumed. But somewhere beneath the neon, the legend of Tony and Michael lingered, a pair of brothers who tried to build an empire and ended up feeding it. People still talk about their final ride, the quiet drive through the desert to the airport, the silence between them, the feeling that maybe, just maybe, Michael knew what Tony refused to see. There's a story that says as they walked into that house in Bensonville, Michael looked at his brother and said softly, "We don't have to do this." And Tony, ever the enforcer, ever the believer in his own invincibility, said, "We do." Maybe it's just a story. Maybe it's true. Either way, it captures everything about them. The stubbornness, the loyalty, the tragedy. Two brothers who couldn't live without each other, walking into the dark together because neither could turn away first. When the coroner's report was released, it was clinical, detached, blunt force trauma, asphyxiation, buried alive. But for those who knew them, it wasn't a report. It was a eulogy. Vegas lost its shadow that day, and Chicago got its silence back. The city that once bowed to Tony Spilotro never spoke his name again. In the end, the Spilotro brothers became something larger than life, symbols of an era that burned itself out. The story of men who mistook fear for power, loyalty for love, and blood for safety. Tony had spent his whole life believing he could bend the rules. But the one rule he could never escape was the simplest one of all. No one outlives the outfit. The desert is quiet now. The cornfields of Indiana are even quieter. But sometimes, when the wind moves through the stalks, locals say it sounds like two men talking. One calm, one angry, both fading into silence. Brothers in blood. Brothers in death. Chapter 14. The Cornfield Murders. Death in Indiana. The sky over Illinois that June morning was pale gray, the kind that promised rain but delivered only heat. The sun was slow to rise, and the air felt heavy, almost watchful. In a quiet suburb northwest of Chicago, two men drove in silence, unaware, or maybe unwilling to admit, that this would be their final journey. Anthony Spilotro sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window as cornfields stretched endlessly beyond the highway. His brother Michael drove, hands tight on the wheel, his face unreadable but tense. There was no music, no small talk, no nervous laughter, just the sound of the tires humming against the road and the faint rattle of the air vents. They were heading toward what Tony believed would be a meeting to make peace with the bosses back home. But peace had never been part of the plan. The Chicago outfit had already made its decision. Tony Spilotro had become a liability, too loud, too violent, too visible. He had broken the first rule of the life: stay in the shadows. The feds had dragged his name through headlines. The Vegas skim had collapsed, and now his crimes were no longer profitable, only embarrassing. The bosses wanted quiet, and Tony had become the noise. Joe Pesci and his inner circle didn't debate it for long. The vote was unanimous. It was time to clean house. Tony was to be dealt with permanently. And since he refused to leave Vegas on his own, they would bring him home under the illusion of reconciliation. It was the perfect trap. For years, Tony had believed his reputation could protect him. He thought loyalty meant immunity. But in the outfit, loyalty had an expiration date, and his had come due. They used the one thing they knew he couldn't resist: family. "Bring your brother," they said. "Let's straighten this out." That line was all it took. Michael, ever loyal, agreed to go. He hoped his presence might soften the meeting, convince them that Tony wasn't a problem anymore. But by the time they landed in Chicago, their fates had already been sealed in whispers and nods. They drove through the suburbs, past houses that looked almost too peaceful for what was about to happen. Tony wore a dark suit, the same kind he'd worn for countless meetings before. He looked calm, maybe even hopeful. He'd been in trouble before and always managed to talk his way out. Maybe he thought he could do it again. One last negotiation, one last show of control. Michael wasn't so sure. He'd seen the shift in his brother's eyes over the past few months. The fatigue, the edge of fear he tried to hide. Tony wasn't the same man anymore. The swagger was gone, replaced by something heavier. The air in the car felt suffocating. Michael rolled down the window and said softly, "You think they'll listen?" Tony didn't answer right away. "They'll listen," he said. "They owe me that much." The house they arrived at was unremarkable. A single-story home with white siding and a trimmed lawn, the kind of place that looked like every other on the street. A few cars were already parked outside. Familiar faces waited at the door, men Tony had known his entire life. Their smiles were polite, their greetings warm, but their eyes were cold. He recognized them, guys from Cicero, old soldiers from the outfit. They shook his hand, clapped his shoulder, told him it was good to see him. Michael followed behind, nervous but silent. They led the brothers inside, down a short hallway, and into the basement. Basements had always been a dangerous place in the mob world. Too private, too quiet, too perfect for what needed to be done. Tony knew it. Every man in that room knew it. But he didn't turn back. Maybe pride kept him there. Maybe denial. Maybe he just couldn't imagine that the same men who'd made him would now unmake him. The basement was simple, bare concrete walls, a small light hanging from the ceiling, a faint smell of oil and dust. There were 6 men waiting. No one said much. Tony scanned the faces, searching for a hint of mercy. He found none. Someone told him to take off his jacket. He hesitated. "Why?" he asked. The answer came not in words, but in motion. One man stepped forward, another behind him. The air shifted. Tony knew. What followed was fast, brutal, and merciless. They didn't shoot him. That would have been too clean, too impersonal. They beat him, methodically, efficiently, with the kind of precision that comes from years of practice. Tony fought back, of course. He always fought, but it didn't matter. He was outnumbered, out of time. The man who had broken so many others with his own hands now felt every ounce of that violence turned inward. Michael tried to intervene, shouting, struggling, begging them to stop. But they turned on him next. It wasn't personal. It was procedure. Witnesses didn't leave rooms like this. When it was done, the brothers lay side by side on the concrete floor. There was no ceremony, no last words, just the sound of heavy breathing from the men standing above them, and then silence. They wrapped the bodies in plastic, loaded them into a car, and drove south toward Indiana. The job wasn't finished until the earth covered them. They found a cornfield near Enos, quiet and isolated. The night sky was thick with clouds. The headlights of the car cut through the darkness as they dug. The soil was soft from rain. They worked quickly, no words exchanged, no hesitation. When the hole was ready, they lowered the brothers in, together, as they had lived, as they had died. A thin layer of dirt, a few shovels of silence, and it was done. The men drove away before dawn, leaving nothing but disturbed soil and the faint echo of a life that had burned too bright for too long. For days, no one knew where they'd gone. In Vegas, rumors spread fast. Some said Tony had gone into hiding, others that he'd been picked up by the feds. The newspapers speculated endlessly, and the FBI watched closely, waiting for someone to slip. But no one did. The code of silence held. Chicago denied everything. Vegas shrugged. It wasn't until over a week later that two hikers in rural Indiana stumbled upon something strange. Freshly turned earth, the faint smell of decay, and fragments of cloth poking through the dirt. The coroner's report confirmed what everyone had already guessed. Tony and Michael Spilotro had been found. The news hit like a thunderclap. The bodies were barely recognizable, beaten, buried, forgotten. For the outfit, it was business. For Vegas, it was the closing of a chapter. For those who'd known the brothers, it was the final proof that loyalty meant nothing in the end. Tony's death was the message Chicago needed to send. No one was above the rules. No matter how powerful you thought you were, the family always had the last word. The funeral in Chicago was small, quiet. No mob procession, no lavish send-off. Just family, a few old friends, and a handful of reporters watching from a distance. The caskets were closed. The air smelled of rain and cigarette smoke. Tony's wife stood still, face pale, eyes dry. Michael's widow sobbed quietly beside her. No one spoke Tony's name aloud for long. It was safer that way. Back in Vegas, the reaction was complicated. For some, his death was just as long overdue. For others, it was the end of something irreplaceable. Tony had been many things, violent, arrogant, cruel. But he'd also been a product of a world that no longer existed. Vegas had moved on from men like him. The corporations had taken over, the mob had retreated, and the city had traded fear for glamour. The death of the Spilotro brothers wasn't just a killing. It was the symbolic end of an era. The desert, once ruled by men with guns and loyalty, now belonged to men with briefcases and contracts. The FBI considered the case a victory, even if they hadn't pulled the trigger. They'd watched it happen, in a way. The pressure they put on Chicago, the investigations, the arrests, all of it had forced the outfit to clean its own house. The Bureau didn't need to catch Tony. They just needed to make him unsustainable. When his body surfaced, one agent supposedly said he finally found the silence he gave everyone else. It was cruel, maybe, but fitting. In Chicago, things went quiet again. The bosses didn't celebrate, but they didn't mourn either. They just moved on. Vegas operations were restructured. The remaining contacts folded into safer hands. The Spilotro name vanished from ledgers, from conversations, from history. It was as if he had never existed. That's how the outfit kept order, erased the noise, buried the chaos, and pretend it never happened. But legends don't disappear that easily. Over the years, stories about Tony and Michael became part of mob folklore. The cornfield became sacred ground for curiosity seekers, the kind of place where silence hums loud enough to feel like a heartbeat. Hollywood came calling soon after. When Martin Scorsese made Casino, he turned Tony into Nicky Santoro, the violent, doomed enforcer played by Joe Pesci. It was a brutal, electric portrayal, and it cemented Tony's immortality. Millions who never knew his name now knew his story, or at least the cinematic version of it. A story about loyalty, greed, and the inevitability of betrayal. In reality, the truth was quieter. Tony wasn't a monster or a hero. He was a man who believed too deeply in a world that had already moved past him. He thought the old rules, fear, respect, silence, would always work. But times change, and when they do, men like him become relics. He built his life on violence and loyalty, and in the end, both betrayed him. His death in that Indiana cornfield wasn't just a punishment. It was an elegy for a time when the mob ruled Vegas through whispers and gun smoke. Today, the field looks ordinary. The wind moves through the corn, the sky stretches endlessly, and the world keeps turning. But for those who know the story, there's something about that place that feels heavy, haunted. Maybe it's the weight of everything Tony Spilotro represented. The ambition, the ruthlessness, the tragedy of believing you could outsmart fate. Or maybe it's just the sound of history breathing through the stalks, reminding anyone who listens that power never lasts, and silence always wins. In the end, the brothers' bodies were taken from the earth and buried properly, but their legend stayed behind. Vegas still remembers, in its own way. The casinos built over old mob money still flicker under the same desert stars. The tourists walking those bright streets have no idea that the city's foundations are built on bones and blood. Somewhere beneath the neon, the echo of Tony Spilotro still lingers, a ghost in a tailored suit, watching the tables turn without him. He had believed his name would never fade. That fear was enough to keep him alive. But fear dies faster than memory. And memory, like the desert, forgets everything eventually. The cornfield keeps its secrets. The wind moves, the crops sway, and the silence remains. Somewhere out there, under an endless Midwestern sky, the story of the Spilotro brothers sleeps. Two men who loved too fiercely, fought too hard, and trusted too much. In the world they lived in, there were no happy endings. Only holes in the ground and names whispered for a while before they disappeared completely. And so, the cornfield stayed quiet, as it always had been, as it always would be. Chapter 15. Legacy of the Ant. The end of an era. The desert doesn't remember names, only echoes. And yet, decades after Anthony Spilotro's body was found buried beneath Indiana soil, his ghost still drifts through the neon glow of Las Vegas like a whisper that refuses to fade. The man they called the Ant, the enforcer who made Vegas both rich and terrified, was gone. But his story didn't die with him. It lingered, restless, unfinished, woven into the foundations of a city built on vice and memory. In the quiet corners of casinos, in the shimmer of the slot machines, in the eyes of old pit bosses who'd seen too much, his legend still breathes. Not as a man, but as a symbol of ambition, of arrogance, of what happens when you mistake fear for power. When the news of his death hit Vegas in June 1986, it wasn't just another mob killing. It was an obituary for an entire way of life. The old Vegas, the one run by men in silk suits with blood on their hands, was over. The corporations had already begun their takeover. Accountants replaced hitmen. Shareholders replaced soldiers. The same streets that once trembled under Tony's footsteps now echoed with tourists dragging suitcases. And yet, if you looked closely, if you stood in the right place at the right hour, you could still feel the pulse of the old world beneath the concrete. A faint vibration, like the heartbeat of something buried alive. Tony's murder didn't surprise anyone who knew the rules. He had defied Chicago too long, drawn too much heat, played too loudly in a game that demanded silence. But the brutality of it, the way he and his brother vanished, the way their bodies were found, shook even hardened men. It was a message sent not just to the underworld, but to history itself. The outfit wanted the world to know that no one, not even their own most famous enforcer, could outlive the family. That lesson landed like a hammer. Every associate, every bookmaker, every crooked executive who had once whispered Tony's name and on now spoke it in a hush, afraid it might summon ghosts. In Chicago, the bosses moved on. Business had to continue. The Vegas operation was reorganized, stripped of its volatility, rebuilt under quieter hands. To them, Tony was already old news, a problem solved. But for the men who had worked with him, who had followed him from the alleys of the Patch to the glimmering towers of Nevada, the silence left behind was deafening. They said that for weeks afterward, even the casinos felt different, as if the city itself was holding its breath. The laughter of the high rollers sounded hollow. The dealers' smiles looked rehearsed. It was as though Vegas knew that one of its architects had finally fallen beneath its own weight. Frank Collada, Tony's former friend turned informant, heard the news while under witness protection. He said nothing for a long time, then whispered, "I knew it was coming." There was no triumph in his voice, no satisfaction, just the heavy truth that every man in their life carried like a curse. No one walks away clean. Collada would spend the rest of his life talking about Tony in interviews, documentaries, and books. He said Tony was complicated, smart, loyal, terrifying, self-destructive. He said he loved him like a brother and feared him like the devil. That contradiction was who Tony Spilotro really was, a man who could inspire both devotion and terror in the same heartbeat. In Vegas, people try to distance themselves from him. Casino executives who had once shared drinks with Tony now swore they barely knew him. Politicians who had looked the other way pretended ignorance. The city rebranded itself as something newer, cleaner, brighter. The mob had become bad for business, and Tony's death gave them the excuse to bury the past. But the truth couldn't be erased. Every casino that rose under corporate ownership still carried traces of the money that Tony helped skim. Every deal signed in a conference room still echoed with the memory of the envelopes that once changed hands in dimly lit back offices. Vegas was built on shadows, and Tony had been one of the architects. The movies came later. In 1995, Martin Scorsese released Casino, and suddenly, Tony Spilotro's story was resurrected for the world to see. Joe Pesci's portrayal of Nicky Santoro was violent, magnetic, unforgettable. For millions who had never heard Tony's real name, that movie became a myth. It turned him into something larger than life, a cinematic monster born of greed and loyalty. But those who had known the real man said the truth was even darker. Nicky was an exaggeration, one old associate said. Tony didn't explode for the camera. He burned slow. The movie made him immortal in a way he never expected. Tourists began visiting Vegas to see the places where he'd walked, the restaurants he'd eaten in, the casinos he'd once controlled. They took photos, read the legends, whispered about the man who'd ruled this desert empire. They didn't see the human being beneath the myth, the boy from the patch who had grown up fighting on Chicago's rough streets, the man who'd chased power because he thought it would finally make him safe. They didn't see the fear that had followed him, the nights he couldn't sleep, the paranoia that chewed away at him like a slow acid. They saw the legend, not the loneliness. To the FBI, Tony's death was proof that justice in the mob world didn't always come from the courts. They had tried for years to put him away, on racketeering, murder, extortion, but he had always slipped through the cracks. It was Chicago, not the government, that finally ended him. The Bureau called it self-correction. They understood the logic of it. The mob was cleaning its own house, and that was fine by them. But behind closed doors, there was disappointment too. They hadn't wanted the story to end in a cornfield. They wanted him on the stand, in prison, broken by the system. Instead, he was swallowed by his own. Even now, the details of his final days are debated. Who gave the order? Who swung the first punch? Who buried the bodies? Some names have surfaced, others remain rumor. The men who were there are either dead or too old to talk. But everyone agrees on one thing. It wasn't personal. In the outfit, it never was. Tony's downfall was business, calculated, cold, necessary. He'd become a liability to an organization that demanded invisibility. His fame was his death sentence. The more famous he got, the more inevitable his end became. Michael's death, though, still haunts people. He wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't one of them, not really. He was collateral damage in a story that had no room for innocence. His murder was the part that made even hardened mob men uneasy. It crossed a line that wasn't supposed to be crossed. Killing Tony was business. Killing Michael was punishment. It was a way of saying, this is what happens when you forget who you belong to. The years that followed turned the Spilotro name into both myth and warning. To young mobsters, his story was cautionary, an example of how power could turn to poison. To historians, he became a symbol of the mob's last great stand in Las Vegas. To pop culture, he became an icon. But to the few who had known him as more than a headline, he was just Tony, a man who'd lived too fast, burned too hot, and never learned when to stop. Chicago changed after his death. The bosses who ordered his murder would themselves fall within a year, taken down in the massive family secrets investigation that unraveled decades of hidden crimes. The outfit survived, but smaller, quieter, buried deeper in legitimate business. Vegas, meanwhile, became what it always wanted to be, a spectacle. The city shed its skin, trading shadows for spotlights. The mob's fingerprints faded, but not entirely. Beneath the glass towers and LED signs, the foundation remained the same, built on greed, risk, and illusion. Tony would have understood that. Vegas didn't kill him. It simply evolved beyond him. In the years before his death, Tony used to tell people that Vegas was the only place in the world where you could disappear in plain sight. You can lose yourself under these lights, he once said, and no one will ever notice. In the end, he was right. The man who once ruled the city vanished beneath it. Sometimes when the night falls quiet and the strip hums with that low, endless vibration, old-timers say you can still feel him there, in the faint smell of cigarette smoke, in the rhythm of the dice hitting the table, in the way certain corners of old casinos still feel heavier than others. Not haunted exactly, just watched. The ghosts of Vegas don't haunt to scare. They haunt to remind. In Chicago, his childhood neighborhood, the Patch barely resembles what it once was. The bars are gone, the old houses replaced by new developments. But every now and then, someone mentions a Spilotro boy who made it big and died bigger. The kids who grow up there today don't know his name, but the old ones remember. They remember the fights, the confidence, the ambition. They remember how he left to chase something greater and never came back. The legacy of Anthony Spilotro is a paradox. He was a criminal, yes, a violent man who brought blood to a city built on illusion. But he was also a symbol of a world where loyalty was currency and fear was the only insurance policy. In the end, that world consumed itself. The men who ruled Vegas with fists and whispers were replaced by men who ruled it with contracts and branding. The mob's Vegas was gone, but its blueprint remained, etched into every deal, every risk, every game of chance. Tony's story didn't end in that cornfield. It just changed form. It became part of the myth of Las Vegas itself, the city that never stops spinning, never stops gambling, never stops seducing men into believing they can beat the odds. And like every gambler before him, Tony played until there was nothing left to lose. His grave in Chicago is modest, tucked between rows of other forgotten names. No grand monument, no gold lettering, just a stone, simple and quiet. But people still visit. Some come out of curiosity, others come out of respect. A few bring flowers. They leave them in silence, maybe thinking about the life he lived, or maybe just wondering how a man could build so much power and lose it all so quickly. Vegas didn't mourn him long. It never does. The city is built to forget, to replace every old story with a new one. But somewhere between the lights and the dust, there's still a trace of the man who tried to own it all. The enforcer who became a legend, the brother who became a ghost, the aunt who thought he could bite the hand that fed him. Anthony Spilotro's life was a mirror of the city he ruled. Bright on the surface, dark underneath, beautiful and cruel in equal measure. He believed he was building an empire. What he built was a warning. And though the cornfield swallowed his body, the legend of the man who made Las Vegas bleed still walks its streets, unseen but never forgotten. Because in the end, every city has its ghosts. And Las Vegas, the city of illusions, the city of second chances, has his. He's there in the shadows behind the blackjack table, in the whisper of dice rolling across green felt, in the hum of air that never cools, the smoke that never clears. He's the reminder that in Vegas, luck runs out, but stories don't. Anthony Spilotro didn't die in 1986. Not really. He became part of the mythology that built the city he once controlled. The last echo of the old world, swallowed by the new, but still pulsing beneath it, like a faint heartbeat under the desert floor. The end is gone, but the city he helped shape still glitters in his image, beautiful, dangerous, and always hungry for the next soul who believes he can play the game and win. And in that hunger, in that endless spin of risk and reward, his legacy lives on, forever buried, forever watching, forever Vegas.